Okay, I'll call the committee to order. Want to express my appreciation to the legislative members of the committee, and particularly Senator Don Darrell Loop, for making arrangements for us to be able to eat in this room. We appreciate your accommodation. So we'll proceed with the next presentation. President Sandoval, welcome to you and your team.
Your Honor, Mr. Chair, Madam Vice Chair Chancellor, legislators, regents, members of the committee, for the record, Brian Sandoval, President of the University of Nevada, Reno. To my right is the Executive Vice President and Provost, Jeff Thompson, and to my left is Andrew Klinger, the Chief Financial Officer of the university. It's our privilege and honor to be with you today. I'm going to start, Mr. Chair, with a thought, and rather than going straight to my prepared remarks, because you said something at the beginning of the meeting that really caught my attention. And you talked about, Mr. Chair, this weekend in Las Vegas, and you talked about the Super Bowl and how this community and how this region and how the state rose to the occasion. And it made it clear to the nation who we are, and that this is a destination unlike any other in the way that this was all put together. And I thought to myself that today's hearing is an analog to that with regard to higher education. I want people from out of state to think about our system of higher education in the very same way that they think about this region and how we were able to put on a show unlike any other. And 10 years ago, we would have never thought or said that. We would have never thought or said that we would have the infrastructure and the talent to be able to produce something like this. And today, we did it better than anybody. And I see this as a moment in time, similarly, for higher education. So I'm very excited about that. And I also, Mr. Chair, as I listen to the questions of the committee, I really saw some parallels with what we were looking at for K through 12 education 10 plus years ago. And we recognized that there was a funding model that unfortunately treated the system of K through 12 in this state the same way it treated it 50 years before, 60 years before. And we knew that we needed to modernize things and really recognize the change in demographics and the change, particularly here in Southern Nevada, with the amount of growth that was here, and the increase in diverse populations and at-risk populations. And we did things like creating the Zoom schools and the Victory schools for the ESL students and for students at risk. We had half-day kindergarten, and we made all-day kindergarten. We implemented a lot of different things that really recognized that we were behind, but by the same token, we put the money behind it. And it was a historical tax increase, the most in the history of the state, but we invested it in K through 12. And so again, I see a moment of time, a parallel here, where now we need to do the same thing for higher education. Because, you know, respectfully, and I was there when this new funding formula was created, I'll just put it this way, it needs to change. It doesn't work for now. It just simply doesn't work for now. And essentially what we're doing have been doing is dividing up the same piece of pie in different ways and not really increasing the amount of funding that we had. So for me, and I think I can speak for the others, this is a historical moment. And this committee, I think, was a brilliant stroke, and the membership of this committee was a brilliant stroke to bring all the different individuals together to make recommendations to the 2025 legislature so that we can do something visionary and historic when it comes to higher education, because the state is completely different than when it was when this funding formula was created. And frankly, the amount of money in our state budget has increased dramatically, and there hasn't been a proportional share that's been devoted to higher education. And, you know, we did, and we should have put all that money into K through 12. But where do you think those K through 12 students go when they finish high school? Most of them come to our institutions, be it the research institutions, Nevada State University, or the community colleges. And so we need to recognize that. So with that, Mr. Chair, I am going to save us time. And given what's happening, what I was going to do in the first part of my presentation is you had talked about also that for us to talk about our mission and goals and how those fit together. And we being the University of Nevada, Reno, recently prepared a strategic plan, and it was approved by our Board of Regents. Thank you. But it really does match up, you know, what our goals are and our priorities and how we're going to get there. And I really think the easier way would be to just provide the committee with a copy of the strategic plan to give you the opportunity to review those rather than going through this, because many of the members have already heard all this and have approved it. But I think you'll see that this plan recognizes that we are a 150-year-old institution and that we have changed, obviously, through the years, and that we are viewing what is going to happen between now and 2027 through the completion of this year and what our priorities are going to be and what we're going to accomplish. So with your permission, Mr. Chair, may I go straight to what were the questions were and what your specific interest was in terms of the funding of higher education and what our recommendations would be. And I would start again with my comments is that we need to do similar to what we did through K through 12. So, Mr. Chair, with regard to the funding formula, the first thing that I'd like to speak about is considering the student demographics of our students. Our current funding model focuses solely on student credit hours while neglecting the individual needs and challenges that many of our students face. The new funding formula recommended by this committee should allocate resources towards initiatives specifically designed to address the needs of first-generation and underrepresented students, ensuring that every person, regardless of their background, has an equal opportunity to succeed. First-generation and underrepresented students often encounter unique challenges that can hinder their academic success, financial constraints, lack of support services, feelings of isolation, to name a few. And I suppose I'll pause here, Mr. Chair, and members of the committee. You're going to hear similar themes from us as you heard from President Whitfield, and I believe his comments were excellent and right on point. But essentially, the makeup of our university is changing. And I'm so proud that the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, UNLV, is a Hispanic serving institution. It requires that you have a 25% enrollment of Hispanic students. We're at 24.8%. So we're almost there, and we're going to get there. But more than half of our incoming freshman class that are here now came from diverse backgrounds. So these are students that are matriculating from high schools from throughout the state of Nevada, and they bring with them the same needs and challenges, many of whom are first-generation students. So they have a lot of specific needs when they arrive on our campus. So prioritizing their outcomes in the new funding formula will help to close the achievement gap by providing targeted support and resources that address these barriers and promote success. And improving outcomes for first-generation and underrepresented students directly contributes to higher retention and graduation rates, benefiting the students, the university, and obviously our state. This is what our state looks like now, and we need to respond. We should be investing in initiatives such as mentorship programs, academic advising, and financial aid tailored to the needs of these students. And as the workforce becomes increasingly diverse, we should prepare a diverse pipeline of talent. So by prioritizing these outcomes, we ensure that all students are equipped with the support they need to succeed in their chosen fields, making a positive economic impact on our community and beyond. So next I'll move, Mr. Chair, to what does it cost to educate a student at an R1 university compared to a community college? So our current funding formula assumes that the cost of providing lower division courses is equal across all 7 teaching institutions in the Nevada system of higher education. However, we believe this assumption overlooks the unique missions and resources of each institution. There is a difference in costs between institutions within the Nevada system of higher education, and we need to conduct a comprehensive study, and I think this is within what we are doing here, to analyze these cost differences so that we can develop a funding model that reflects these variations. And again, and I'm partially guilty of it, Mr. Chair, because I was there was this view that we are all the same, and we're not. And we all have our strengths, and we all have our respective costs and needs, and we can do this. We did it for K through 12, and we can do it here with all the respective different school districts and the institutions here. So as you heard from my colleague, President Whitfield, both of our R1 universities invest significantly in research and innovation infrastructure, including state-of-the-art laboratories, performing arts centers, specialized equipment, and cutting-edge technology. These resources are essential for conducting groundbreaking research, advancing knowledge that benefits humanity, and providing students with hands-on learning experiences that prepare them for success in their respective careers. Nevada's R1 universities attract and retain highly qualified faculty who are internationally recognized experts in their fields and dedicated to research, teaching, and service to their communities. These faculty members enrich the learning environment and provide students with the access to the latest developments in their disciplines and their respective fields. And again, I'll go off my prepared remarks, Mr. Chair. It's a very competitive environment out there. And it breaks my heart, and I'm sure the provost can talk more about this. We have amazing faculty, and then they get offers from other institutions that are significantly more than what we're able to pay. And we do our best. And sometimes these individuals make these career decisions to go where they need to go, and then we have to go out and recruit and bring in somebody new, and there's a cost associated with that. So if we just paid them what they deserve, and by the way, the 23% COLA was very helpful, but this goes into this discussion. We're very grateful to the legislature for approving in our regions this 23%, but they were only funded at 60%. And so we needed to make up that gap. And for our research, those aren't state supported budgets. And so we have to cover 100% of that cost. And for the non-supported state budgets, for example, parking, student services, again, none of that is covered by state support. It has to be absorbed within the institution. So it makes it, those are challenges that we have that are different from the institutions. And you heard my colleague talk about some of the specializations that we have. We have some of the greatest faculty in the world in their respective places, but it is a very competitive area out there in terms of trying to retain them so that we can have them. So you talked a lot about inflation. And so as you know, the funding formula does not take into account inflation. So for us, utility costs have gone up $5.5 million per year. And again, that's the reality of it. We all see our own power bills, and I'm not picking on the power company. It costs what it costs. And I used to do that kind of legal work in front of the Public Utilities Commission. It's all justified and vetted. But I think the more important thing is, the question that was asked is, we have to find that money somewhere. I mean, we have to pay our bills. And so that's $5 million that we could have used, for example, for our digital Wolfpack initiative, where we provide iPads for our students so that they have digital equity and digital acuity. This takes away from our ability to help fund that 40% that wasn't funded from the last session of the legislature. And it's not just power, it's food. It's everything that all of us. It's gas. We have vehicles that are all over campus. We have to buy supplies for that, so that it's not just the power bill. It's a lot of other things that we need to account for, which essentially decreases the amount we can do in other places because this wasn't budgeted in the first place. So it would be very important, again, for there to be some type of an accounting or fund with regard to inflation on our, or that it takes account for inflation on our campuses. So I'll move on, Mr. Chair. With regard, again, a discussion is having the same funding formula as the community colleges. And I love our community colleges. And as I tell our community, my colleagues, their students are our students. And, you know, I'll get into the discussion with regard to the provisions for those students who make the decision to come to our university and transfer from the community college. But right now, essentially what the funding formula operates under a one-size-fits-all funding model that fails to adequately recognize the different roles and needs of our R1 universities compared with the other institutions in our system. And this is a big one. And again, it's hard. And anything worthwhile isn't going to be easy. But I think there really needs to be a discussion with regard to this committee considering implementing different funding modes tailored to the diverse institutions within our system of higher education. It can be done. And I think in the past, we tried to do too much in too short of an amount of time, and it just was easier to basically treat all the institutions the same when now we're seeing somewhat of the consequences of that it really doesn't work. So a funding model for an R1 university should prioritize resources for research infrastructure, faculty support, and also graduate education to maintain those graduate students, to attract them to our campuses and to keep them on our campuses, because again, those graduate students that are ones that are really important with regard to economic development in the future of the state. So next, so I guess I'll close with that piece. A funding model for an R1 university should ensure sustained funding to attract and retain top talent, ensure the quality of graduate education. And again, as an aside, the graduate students don't just show up, Mr. Chair. We have to recruit them and we have to compete for them. They have a choice to go to a lot of different institutions across the country, and they look towards the amount of the graduate stipends that they will receive. And again, thank you to the legislature for increasing those stipends, but they are still not able to make ends meet in terms of our graduate students because of the cost of living, and I'll speak specifically to Northern Nevada. So next area that I'd like to talk about is how do our universities maintain their Carnegie High One, very high research activity. So within the funding formula, there is a component that recognizes and funds the research mission of our R1 university. And this includes an additional 10% course weight for upper division, master's, and doctoral courses, as well as for operation and maintenance funding for research space on campus. It's important that the new formula continues these provisions to support the research missions at our two R1 universities. I'm really proud of both of our universities in terms of the rankings, but we need to sustain, in order to sustain the status, we have to have ongoing investments in research infrastructure, faculty support, and student opportunities. So as I sat here listening to my colleague and thinking about, for example, facilities, and Mr. Chair and others who are alumni of the University of Nevada, Reno, we have classrooms and laboratories that are unchanged from the day that you attended there. And I attended there too, just for the record, Mr. Chair. And so we know how much this world has changed in the decades that have gone through. I know I can speak for me as a student who was at that university in the 80s, and as I travel through our campus, there are classrooms that are no different than they were than when I was there. And I know because they were no different then, they were no different prior to that. I'll speak to our Fleischman building, which was the home of our College of Agriculture, Biotechnology, and Natural Resources. You know, this building was built before any of the other institutions were even created. And if you walk through this building, and I'll use this term, you can't Frankenstein a building anymore. I mean, you have iron stations out in the hallways because the requirements change for research. We have storage, cold storage for some of the experiments that the faculty are working on that are in rooms that were never built for that. We have a heating and cooling system that is 100 years old, and there's only one temperature. It's either really hot or really cold. And so these are things that really affect our ability to continue to grow. I mean, we're really, and I'll get into this with regard to the amount of research that we are doing, but there's a reason why we've come, seeking for some help with regard to some new buildings for our campus, a life sciences building, because we need modern research infrastructure for a modern faculty and a modern student and a modern mission. And I talk about us being an original land-grant institution, but I also talk about us being a land-grant 2.0. We have to be a land-grant institution for now and into the future, not for one that existed 20 to 30 years ago. We need, in order to attract top faculty and top students, we have to have the resources and the physical structure to match. And these are the students, these are the faculty that go on and come into the workforce. So, our campus is a little bit different because we are so old. I mean, we're celebrating our 150th anniversary. And as I said, there are some buildings that are still there from the 30s, 20s, 40s, even 1885. I mean, it's, there's some special needs on this campus. So we need a funding formula that supports research infrastructure and ensures that the university can provide scholars and researchers with access to advanced resources and technology needed to continue conducting groundbreaking research and innovation. You simply cannot do research in a 1950s laboratory for 2024. It can't be done. We need to maintain our competitiveness, and recognition is vital. So the University of Nevada's Reno's Carnegie R1 status enhances its competitiveness for research grants, contracts, and partnerships, and provides unique opportunities for our students. Our research portfolio, and I just found this out from our VP of Research, or Vice President of Research and Innovation, Dr. Gautam, we have our highest research amount in the history of our institution, $189 million, which is significantly higher, more than 50% higher than it was 10 years ago. Those are our research expenditures. In terms of research at the university, it's about $260 million, I believe it is. So we are, even with the challenges that I've talked about, we continue to increase our research goals and maintain our standing amongst the Carnegie R1 institutions. But we need help from the state. We just need it in order to have the facilities to match what's going on in the state of Nevada. So next subject that I'll move on to, Mr. Chair, is how do we incentivize our institutions to improve performance? And we've had a lot of discussion with regard to the performance pool. And, again, I think this is something where we need to basically shake the Etch-a-Sketch and start over again. The performance pool is mostly based on increasing enrollment and degrees conferred. And so when enrollment goes down, you can't meet some of those requirements, even though our graduation rate may be higher than it was before. And so right now, we simply, the way it works is to break even. There's this holdback of 20%, and we do these things just to get so that we're treading water versus creating a system where we're truly incentivized in order to achieve goals. So I'd prefer that we have a new funding formula that introduces a performance pool, providing additional funding rather than one that is contingent on earning things back. This adjustment would promote the pursuit of stretch goals and foster a culture of innovation, accountability, and excellence. We can enhance our performance effectiveness and impact, which ultimately advances our mission of teaching, research, and service to the community. So I Like I said, I'm all for a performance pool, but it should be about truly incentivizing being innovative and creative and creating basically new things and increasing our graduation rate and our retention rates versus increasing enrollment, and you're probably going to get more graduate degrees, more degrees conferred in any way. Anyway, so how do institutions continue to invest in critical capital and infrastructure needs? So first and foremost, I want to thank the governor and the legislature because they did give us an additional $50 million to the Nevada system of higher education to address critical deferred maintenance needs. That's $50 million divided everywhere. That's not just $50 million to the University of Nevada, Reno. But that was one-time funding. And you heard me talk about the dates of the dates and some of our facilities being older than others. So back in 2010, and perhaps you've looked at this, but there was a comprehensive study commissioned by the Nevada System of Higher Education, which examined buildings across all 7 teaching institutions. And the findings were stark. The University of Nevada, Reno alone needed $55 million annually to maintain its buildings in fair condition. Adjusted for inflation, that figure would be approximately $94.2 million in today's dollars. So since 1985, and we're grateful for this, the state of Nevada has allocated about $15 million per biennium for deferred maintenance across the system, when the University of Nevada, Reno alone is over $50 million. And that would be adjusted for inflation from 2010, that would be about $26 million. And at the same time, our university's enrollment has more than doubled since 1985, leading to campus expansion to accommodate increased demand for classrooms and lab spaces. So to address these critical needs, I propose establishing a dedicated revenue source that grows with our increase in enrollment and inflation rates. And right now, we have a business building that is under construction, which, by the way, with zero state money, because this is the only way that we could get it done, because we have a dated business building, which was brand new when I was a student there in 1984, which is also shared by the College of Liberal Arts. So it's that old building simply couldn't, keep up with what's going on. And again, it's a dated building, so we have an increasing student enrollment within our business school that we need a new business building to address that. So I also recommend that this committee propose legislation granting each county with an NSHE institution the authority to increase revenue specifically designated for these projects. Now, this is different, Mr. Chair, and this is something that we did for K through 12. And I think it's time that we have an opportunity to do this for the respective institutions in their respective counties. In other words, seeking permission to go to the county commission and go to the voters for a very small increment to allow for new capital construction on our campuses. We did this for K through 12 with the sales tax increment in Washoe County, and you see what it's done. It's built new schools, it's modernized other schools, and this is a way for the community to really get involved for a small amount of money to improve the buildings and facilities on our respective campuses, because we can't keep up the way it is right now. $15 million a year doesn't do it, and this other $50 million is helpful, but for us, we're not able to keep up. And with all the different changes with regard that are essential for safety and accessibility. I mean, we have buildings that far preceded the adoption of the American with Disabilities Act, and we're using this money that we got from the legislature to update and invest in all of our buildings. So, Mr. Chair, I'm going to stop there and be happy to respond to any questions that you or members of the commission or this committee have, but we're really pleased about the wisdom of creating this committee because, as I said, I'll finish where I started. This is a real unique opportunity in the history of our state. And in the past 10 years, We've increased funding for healthcare. That's brought us, not where we need to be, but brought us a long way. We've invested in K through 12, which has brought us an extremely long way. We've invested in economic development to attract companies, but we haven't done it proportionally with higher ed. And here's a chance to do that. And again, have that conversation when people come to our state and have them talk about higher ed and our universities and our community colleges in the same way they talk about the infrastructure that we've built for our economy. So with that, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. President. One quick question, but before I ask it, I want to extend the same invitation to you that I extended to President Whitfield, and I extend to all of the presidents. You're all very smart people, and you've got some great staff. It seems to me that formula changes should be a collaborative effort, and I invite you to submit specific changes to a formula that the committee can look at.
Yeah.
There's a twist I wanted to ask you about on goal 4 of your slide, strategy 2. You reference a move toward achieving the American Association of Universities membership indicators. I wasn't familiar with that. I don't know if others on the committee are. That seemed different or in addition to the R1 designation. Could you elaborate on that so that the committee has a sense of what that means and what's involved?
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. So when we reference the American Association of Universities, essentially that's the top 62 research universities in the country. And so as part of our Wolfpack Rising and our strategic plan, we are making strategic investments in our faculty and in our facilities so that maybe someday, this is a real stretch goal. These are the 62 greatest research institutions in the United States of America. And historically, actually, the University of Nevada, Reno was one of those long way back. And to be able to achieve that recognition would really put us in a special place with regard to research institutions. We're very proud of our Carnegie, and everything we do in Carnegie helps inform achieving AAU.
There was a discussion with President Whitfield, and want to run this by you also. You don't have to respond now, but as part of the thinking about funding R1 universities in the state, is the model that is applicable to DRI something that can be applied to the research portion of each university's efforts? It's something I think we ought to look at. Mr. Christensen touched on that a bit with his questions. I think we should consider how can we advance that kind of model. I know you're getting grants in, but it seems like we should be able to support that effort from state funding, but also support it through the innovation that it creates.
Mr. Chair, if I may, I'm Brian Sandoval, President of the University of Nevada, Reno, for the record. And I'll defer to Mr. Klinger and the provost, but we would benefit dramatically from that because, again, doing $189 million in research expenditures and $287 million in research funding, it's a 58% increase since FY20. It would be very beneficial to us and would recognize who we are. And I'm not going to go back in terms of the facilities, but, being able to recruit the type of faculty that we'd like, and also to be able to pay the faculty that we have. So, Mr. Klinger.
Your Honor, Chair Hardesty, Vice Chair Charlton, members of the committee. For the record, Andrew Klinger, Vice President, Administration and Finance at the University of Nevada, Reno. And I think the answer is yes. And I think really what we need to look at, and this is in one of our recommendations, is you need to look at, I think, the data across the system, specifically the costs, right? And President Whitfield specifically mentioned on research that we had recently done a study that had identified that what the state is supporting as it relates to research just the operation of research space is insufficient. So I think if we can look at that sort of data and build that into either the base budget with some sort of incremental change going forward, that would make sense. But I think, again, just looking at what does it cost the R1 universities for their research mission, and how do you build that into the formula? And I think as this committee deliberates that, I think that's some information that perhaps the consultant can put together for all of the institutions.
Okay, thank you. Any questions from my colleagues on the committee for the president? Yes, Mr. Brooks.
Mr. Chair, the provost had something he wanted to
Oh,
comment
I'm
on that
sorry.
question, if that's okay.
Go ahead. My apologies.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Vice Chair and members of the committee. For the record, Jeff Thompson, Executive Vice President and Provost for the University of Nevada, Reno. To the question about innovation and technology transfer and moving in those directions, there are some wonderful university models on how to move in that direction and the investment that it takes. We have very curious and exceptional faculty who have ideas all the time, but taking that, they didn't come to a university typically to develop a business or a technology idea, and creating the infrastructure so that if a faculty member can figure out how to put a film on glass that reduces energy costs, how do we take that to developing a technology, to making sure we have the IP that we can move that forward? We have some work to go in our system, and as President Whitfield had mentioned, having worked at Duke, he has seen this before. There are ways we can make progress, but it does take some investment to go in those directions.
Great point. Maybe a hire Mr. Christensen.
Mr. Chair, if I may, and I have some real life example here that I think Member Christensen would be interested in
Why
hearing.
don't you provide that to the committee, and we'll circulate that as an addition, as a supplement to your PowerPoint, if that'd be okay. Mr. Brooks and then Mr. Christensen.
Thank you, Chair. For the record, Byron Brooks. Thank you very much for the presentation, President Sandoval, and thank you, Provost, for being here. I do have a question that might be more directed to the to Mr. Klinger, based on your unique position of having served as CFO in the system. My question, the first one is, it seems pretty clear to me that there's a theme with the institutions, and that's simply a one-size-fits-all funding formula might not be the best practice measures for us in this state. Would you care to make any type of comment or suggestion on that?
Mr. Chair, through you to Regent Brooks, for the record, Andrew Klinger. No, I agree, and I think in the President's remarks, I think what we would recommend is that there are different formulas that recommend or that account for the unique missions of the institutions. R1 institutions are very different than the other institutions within the system, and we have different costs. And again, I think this is where it comes back to, as part of this committee's work, I think what the consultant should look at is what are those cost differences? Because even under the current weighting of the course structure that we have under the current formula, we didn't do a cost study here in Nevada. We looked at other cost studies that were done in other states. So I think it's important that Nevada have its own cost study as part of this to look at what the differences are.
Thank you. And then it seems part of the theme also is that unintendedly, based on the funding formula, it's created competition within our state amongst our institutions. And I think we have plenty of growing competition within our state with institutions who are offering strictly online education and other institutions and corporations that are coming in from other areas to add to what education could look like in the state of Nevada. And so I think it's important probably as we move forward that we take those considerations in to make sure that we're not setting up institutions to compete with one another. In one of the slides that we saw from earlier today, there was something called the economic development metrics. And my question is, in terms of that metrics specific to the institutions or at UNR, what does that look like in terms of an amount of percentage that a declared economic development metrics by the institution would play in overall funding for the institution?
For the record, Andrew Klinger, Mr. Chairman, through you to Regent Brooks. And I think the President, in his remarks, said this, that really those current metrics are driven by enrollment growth. I mean, and if you go back and you look at those charts and you look at, not to pick on Nevada State University, but if you look at Nevada State University, you will see year over year over year, they get farther and farther away from their targets at 100%, and at some point they get to 200%. That's primarily driven because of enrollment. When you look at CSN in FY25, the last year, the reason they're down is not because of their performance, it's because their enrollment is down. So I think what we need to look at as part of this, as the President mentioned, is other performance-related metrics, whether it's graduation rates, retention rates. I mean, that's really what we need to be looking at as an additional funding source, not necessarily a carve-out.
Thank you, Mr. Klinger. I appreciate your time. Thank you, Chair. I have no other questions.
Glenn Christensen for the record. I've learned a number of things today. One of which is I always thought when we were talking about funding formula, we were talking about operating budgets and so forth. Between your testimony, Mr. President, and that of President Whitfield, I've come to understand the importance of the infrastructure and particularly capital requirements for the different programs that we have. Separate from that, there's a whole discussion around deferred maintenance, which is a real challenge. Unfortunately, my own alma mater suffers from this. They didn't address this. Well, they've never really addressed it. At any rate, my question is, should we be thinking in terms of funding formula, like an operating funding formula, and then separately a capital budget formula, maybe even separated into deferred maintenance?
Chair Hardesty, through you to Member Christensen, for the record, Andrew Klinger. I think that is exactly what we are recommending today, is that, you know, there is a funding formula for the operation of the institution, and primarily it's the instruction, student support. I mean, there are certain categories that those state funds support, but in addition to that, right now, you know, outside of that $15 million every 2 years that we get, we have to go to the legislature every year, and we are competing with corrections and every other state agency. And so, as the President recommended, what we're looking at is there needs to be a dedicated funding source for each institution that, again, as the economy grows and inflation grows, that it keeps up with that. So as we grow as an institution, we can continue to not only expand but also renovate some of the buildings on campus. We would envision that that funding would not only be used to renovate, but it would also be used to expand where needed. So I think the answer is yes, we need both, and they are two separate things.
What also occurs to me is that I obviously can continue to go to the legislature for one-off funds for buildings and so forth, but if we had a dedicated funding stream for capital projects, that might be something that we could actually monetize at the end of the day, go to the private sector or other financiers so that you didn't have to wait such long periods to come up with the funding for a new building.
In Las Vegas, yes. Regent?
Thank you, Chair Hardesty. And I just want a point of clarification. When you mentioned the $15 million for maintenance, I thought that was for the whole system. Okay, I just want to make sure that's on the record. It's not just for UNR. It's $15 million for our entire system per year. And if I'm not mistaken, per biennium, I'm sorry. Yes. And if I'm not mistaken, when you were the CFO for NSHE, Andrew, weren't our maintenance needs system-wide like $100 million plus?
Mr. Chair, for the record, through you to Regent Del Carlo, Andrew Klinger, for the record, that we had identified $160 million in just priority 1 projects. We had rated those on a scale from 1 to I think 5, and just the priority 1 projects alone were $160 million across the system, and that was a couple years ago. With inflation now, those numbers have certainly grown.
In Carson City, are there any questions? 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 Okay, seeing none, Mr. President, thank you for you and your team and your indulgence in presenting and sticking around for that. We appreciate that, and we'll look forward to your additional input on this approach. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right. Then if we could ask President Pollard to come forward on behalf of Nevada State. Yeah.
Can shift.
Yeah.
And if we have any left over, we can continue them at the next meeting.
Okay.
Just so that she can pick up the pace maybe.
Okay. Hi.
Oh, thank you. Other duties as assigned. I'm the primary speaker, though. I'm the primary speaker, so. Yes, ma'am. I'm doing well. Thank you, Chair Hardesty. I'm Darian Pollard, and to members of this committee, I'm delighted to be here representing Nevada State University. Certainly as well would like to acknowledge Chancellor Charlton and our regents, and certainly every member here. For the record, I am Dr. Darian Pollard, president of Nevada State University, the proud president of that organization, and I'm here today to advocate for a long overdue change, I believe, in the Nevada higher education formula. But I also think, as some of my colleagues have captured in their previous conversations, this is an opportunity, I think, to redefine and change the narrative around higher education in the state of Nevada. I am here to tell a story, if you may, and before I do that, I would be remiss if I didn't take the opportunity to introduce to my right and your left our new Vice President of Business and Finance at Nevada State University, Dr. Gloria Walker. She has been on the job all of 3 weeks, so we have agreed that she's just here to support me versus answering any difficult questions, unless it involves a spreadsheet, of which you will take over. But we are delighted to be here. I'd like to tell you a story about Jessica, a typical Nevada State University student who is forging a path to higher education for herself, her family, and our community. But before I do that, let me tell you first a little bit about Nevada State University for those of you who may be less familiar with us as an institution, and some key statistics about how we fit into the landscape of higher education in the state of Nevada. For just over 20 years, Nevada State was created, and we were created to deliver relevant degrees for a rapidly growing populace, what we call the new majority in higher education. First-generation students, adult learners, students of color, dreamers, immigrants, and anyone looking for upward mobility. This is not the traditional trope that you hear described about who attends higher education in this country, and yet Nevada State University exists for that very purpose. Today's population of our students, about 43% of Nevada college students are first generation, and nearly 40% are of immigrant origin. Nevada State continues to tailor our programs and our efforts to respond toward this unique and rapidly growing set of populations in our community. For example, we've crafted new degree programs, such as our educational specialist degree, that directly addresses a critical need in our community. We've also created a new data science program in collaboration with local businesses that express concern about the high expense and low retention rates associated with out-of-state recruitment. We are meeting the needs of our business community with Nevadans who want to start their careers here and who will likely spend their lifetime here. At Nevada State, we act with intention to design, redesign, or reinvent our institution to break down historic barriers that prevent learning. And we do this by focusing simply on great teaching. We are proud to be a teaching institution. We do this also through transformative student experiences, and we do it by empowering employees and creating strategic alliances that advance our mission. We continue to do this because we believe we are a community where anyone can and should belong. And I truly believe that Nevada State University is the future of higher education in Nevada for these reasons. So who are we talking about when we think about higher education at Nevada State? We're talking about Jessica. And we're talking about a persona here that I'm calling Jessica, who represents a typical Nevada State student from the analytics that we've looked at of our institution. Jessica is a 23-year-old Hispanic or Latina female, a transfer student, the first in her family to attend college, and she is working part-time to support her educational goals and her family. She dreams of attending attaining her baccalaureate degree in nursing and allowing her to earn more money for her family and also hopefully allow her to one day buy a home. I tell you her story because she is very typical of the profile of students that we have here pursuing a degree in nursing. This is important because we know that many of our students at Nevada State are pursuing and come with this very similar background. Our mission is about fostering opportunity. It's about supporting students like Jessica. And we strive for excellence in teaching, which we believe leads to innovative, technology-rich learning opportunities that promote the acquisition of interdisciplinary knowledge and skills. And we create quality, affordable degree programs that open doors for career success and enhance the quality of life for our ever-diverse population of students. And our graduates, in turn, foster the greatest opportunity, the promise of a stronger community, and a better future for all of us in Nevada. This slide, you'll see some unique statistics about our institution. And a common figure pops up over and over again, 80%. The Nevada State student body is nearly 80% female, nearly 80% diverse, and more than 80% are receiving some form of financial aid. As has been described, we are a minority serving institution, an Hispanic serving institution, and an Anapeasy institution. And we have graduated thousands of nurses and teachers. In fact, 80% of them have gotten jobs right here in Nevada. 70% of our graduates are employed right here in Southern Nevada. And in response to a question that was asked earlier by one of our committee members, of our 849 graduates just this past year, 546 of them, or 64%, were minority students. 150 of that 849 students were Pell-eligible students. So that means that we are representing the diversity of who our community is right now. I'll also tell you that 70% of those graduates were previously enrolled at a community college. So when we talk about the pipeline of higher education in this state, it is important to note that our university is not just a reflection of the community that we serve. We have grown to be a part of it. Jessica needs support services when she comes to Nevada State. These aren't just perks, these are essential to the experience that she has here. In addition to mandatory advising, more than 70% of our student body seeks support services in a number of robust programs that we have at Nevada State. They benefit from programs like our Nepantla program, our tutoring program, our writing center, career services, and our mental health programs. And as we all know, particularly has been illuminated during our most recent bout with COVID, mental health services are essential to today's college students. This is why we create opportunities for students to take advantage of 5 free counseling sessions, and we help them in any way we can, and to connecting them with community resources to help them navigate a collegiate experience. We also take advantage of our flexible evening classes and innovative programs like those offered in our state-of-the-art Early Childhood Center. And we know our students require more support than those who attend other four-year institutions in our state, and our students will tell you this. We are here for them every step of the way that they attend Nevada State University. And as we discussed previously, our student body is very unique as a four-year institution. More than 2/3 of our students receive some form of financial aid, and of that, they receive Pell Grants. Let me remind you of what that means. For a family of 4 to qualify for a Pell Grant, they would need a maximum of $52,000 a year to qualify for a Pell Grant. Nevada State is literally lifting many of our students out of poverty through agency in higher education. And post-pandemic, we continue to provide flexibility wherever we can, with about 30% of our students being fully remote at Nevada State University. And lastly, we are a driving force in meeting the nursing demand in our community, where about 43% of nursing credits at an NSHE institution come from Nevada State University. This is considerable when you compare that the cost of attending a baccalaureate program in nursing is quite high. For students to do that at Nevada State, it can truly be an incredible opportunity for them and their family. As such, it should come as no surprise to you, as we were asked in the charge of our presentations here to share with you, 70% of Nevada State's 2025 FY25 budget goes toward instruction, academic support, student services, and scholarships to students. That is 70% of what we do. Now that you know a little bit more about our campus and the students we serve, I'd like to discuss potential changes to the higher education funding formula that can make a real difference. Who our students are informs how we do our budget, and they also inform the recommendations I'm offering here today. The current funding formula, as you've heard, heavily favors a more traditional student with weighted credit hours, prescribed summer funding, and performance based on graduates and the composition of graduates. The reality is that the current funding formula is not meeting the needs of our students and so many others in the state who do not fit into the box labeled traditional. To guide my recommendations, I've provided here some evidence-based principles for consideration. The new formula needs to be simple, easy to understand, equitable, quantifiable, and responsive to the unique needs and missions of every institution. Our R1 institutions have a compelling mission that is essential to the state, and they should be funded accordingly. And our community colleges do and will continue to do the necessary and underappreciated work of access in this state. And the reality is that a teaching university such as Nevada State University is directly impacting critical shortages in our labor market and creating viable pathways for those struggling the most in our communities. If we are to change the narrative about higher education in this state, we must challenge the assumptions we have about who should be privileged and an assumption regarding our funding formula. A new future funding formula must reflect a new reality about who is attending higher education in this state. So for me, a few recommendations. Consistent with the principles that I said earlier and the needs of students like Jessica, who are the students that we enroll at Nevada State, I've provided here some high-level recommendations to set us up for success. We need a funding formula that bridges Jessica's journey by funding both inputs, how she shows up at our institutions, as well as outputs, the value add that we bring to her as a student here. That means fully funding Jessica's academic choices by fully funding summer, rewarding her transition from being a dual credit student to being an enrolled college student, encouraging robust support services, investing in her professional future by helping her develop her career pathway, and helping her pay for education by promoting scholarships. Higher education needs to adapt to the needs of students like Jessica, her community, and our evolving workforce. That is a chance for us to ensure that we create a formula that does just that. I want to thank you for your time and allowing me to share some perspectives about Jessica and how we might consider a funding formula for the future. And I'm happy, Mr. Chair, to respond to any questions that you may have of me.
President Pollard, thank you so much for your presentation. I do have a couple, but I was assuming that Dr. Walker was just going to give us the answers. Welcome to Nevada, Dr. Walker.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here.
So in slide 9 that you were referring to, and I find it interesting that you are offering up a similar point that were made by the other two four-year universities, the transition of the student into your institution, coming at essentially a transfer. How does that formula look like? What do you envision? I understand the high level that you've offered, but what would that formula look like?
I think the formula would take into account several things. One, we need a formula that recognizes that our students come from very complex backgrounds. Mm-hmm. So in addition to recognizing first-generation college status, recognizing that many of our students may have to attend part-time and to give them weight and support for that, I would offer that the idea of support services are important. Is there a way to incentivize and provide institutions with resources to help build robust support services for students who attend? And I'm looking, I had some notes because I kind of anticipated this question that you might ask. I would also say that we need a formula that speaks to growth and capacity building. I was struck by my colleagues, President Whitfield and Sandoval, and their comments around the needs of an R1 institution in terms of innovation. I would offer to you that same observation could be seen at the other two sectors of higher education in the state. While we are not producing, our faculty do scholarship, they're not there as a primary mission to produce scholarship. They're there to think about innovation in classroom teaching. They're thinking deeply about what new programs are needed by our community. And yet our funding formula does not incent or provide opportunities for that. In fact, it almost disincents that because it says keep getting what you do now and then work toward that. It doesn't say we have an emerging need in our program. Let's identify resources for that. I'll also share with you, and I have on the other end of the spectrum than President Sandoval, our institution is not 150 years old. We're 21 years old. So building out an institution is not contemplated in this particular funding formula. That is something that I think should be important and conceived in. And last but not least, I have this crazy idea that if we really want to go back to this first slide, and I didn't speak a lot to it, but I suspect many of you, I hope it caught your attention. When we talk about key stats and we think about Nevada, depending on who you look at, we rank 46th, 47th, or 48th in the number of adults who have attained a baccalaureate degree. We have, though, a growing population of first-generation college students, and we also continue to be proud, I believe, recipients of many immigrants who come to higher education. What I would offer to you is that we have to figure out what we want to privilege in this narrative. If we were in Massachusetts, per se, I would offer to you, where anywhere from 45 to 55% of the college populace, adults have a college degree, we might need to then think about how we design a funding formula that moves beyond even the baccalaureate degree. But we got to get more people in school. So a funding formula that recognizes perhaps high school readiness programs and incents us to be able to craft pathways, not just to say we help support you there, but you participating in them. And at the college level, then we provide resources to say you actually did do that. These students participated and they enrolled and that they graduated. Those are a few elements that come to mind. I've had the privilege of working in 3 other states besides Nevada, and I think there's an opportunity for us to benchmark beyond those who are closest to us, but to look across the region and the country about some other ideas about how we might fund design a funding formula.
So personally, I'm really intrigued about the adequacy of funding for the support services that your students need and how we build that into a funding formula is going to be an interesting process. And as I did with the other presidents, I invite your input with language and other resources you might provide for that. You've been very specific about the points. But it is interesting, you have added one more argument, I think, in support of the fact that one size doesn't fit all. And you're servicing a very, very, very important part of the Nevada population. And we need to see that grow. The other thing I thought was interesting is the numbers from your university. As you're expanding, this current formula is not allowing you to be proactive, innovative in a forward-thinking way, is it?
I am so grateful that you amplified that point that I tried to make subtly, and thank you for hearing it. There is one thing to say, here's an institution, and that we want to provide for the needs you have right now. I would offer to you that the funding formula doesn't do that now. Yeah. But to say that then there's a profound need and we need to grow, it doesn't do that. I literally have new programs being developed, wanting to be developed. There's a profound need in our community, yet I don't have faculty to hire to do that. I literally last year with our educational psychology program asked our school system, our K-12 system, to fund the faculty member, and they did. That should not be the case. That we should have to ask a school system to pay for a faculty member who's going to develop a program to produce graduates that they will need. I don't think that that is something that can and should be done. So we have to come up with a way of saying, yes, here's an adequacy, because I think that's part of what was a conversation at some point. How do we adequately fund this, the schools that we have, but how do we also build space for the innovation that needs to occur, the responsiveness needs to occur? At this particular point, that does not exist.
And it's contrary to the NSHE approved mission statement for the Nevada State University, it appears to me, which reads in part, the Nevada State University excellence fosters opportunity. Excellence in teaching leads to innovation, technology-rich learning that promote the acquisition of interdisciplinary knowledge and skills. Seems like you're being held back.
I think that everyone is doing the best they can with a system that was not designed for today's college student. No. I'm often asked to speak about today's students, and there's these old tropes that exist. And these tropes speak to who we think is enrolled in higher education right now. That's not the reality. And I know, and I talk with many, and I get to spend this last biennium with a number talking of our legislators, and they heard me. They understood that this is what, who Nevada State is and who is becoming. And I would even offer what's happening in the southern part of this state. But what's intriguing about this is that, and this is why I would co-sign, if I can, on the comments that President Sandoval made, this is his historic moment. If we want these missions, as you so thoughtfully read, to actually have vigor and relevance, it's going to challenge us to think about the way that we conceive about the value proposition of higher education. I came from a state where I had 3 sources of funding when I designed budgets for my institution. Dr. Walker probably had a similar one as well. We certainly had state apportionments. I also had county resources, and I had student revenue. That was the basic, and it was typically designed to be a third, a third, a third. That was the master plan for higher education in that particular state. It differs across these United States, how that looks. But we have to be willing to challenge the assumption of the current funding formula because, as we are hearing multiple times in this particular conversation set today, it's inadequate for, I think, the vision of what we want the state to be.
Do any of my colleagues on the committee have a question? Yes, Chancellor.
So thank you, President Pollard, for the presentation. So as we've heard from the other two university presidents, how's that? And then we're about to hear from our community college partners. So you're somewhat in the middle, where we've heard, we need to be recognizing our research mission. And then, I know that we'll be talking about workforce development and that open access. What does that look like for you? You have a much higher part-time student population than your university colleagues. What does that look like for you?
I am a unicorn for a couple of reasons, I would imagine. This is my third higher ed presidency, and the first two of those has been spent in two-year institutions. So when I look at my colleagues, Kyle and Federico, and certainly Karen, and Joyce, and what they do at the two-year level, I would offer to you this is the most American of all forms of higher education, what happens at the two-year space. And I would also offer to you as the most underfunded, underrecognized, and taken for granted across all sectors of higher education. I say that as a person who has a doctorate degree from R1 institutions, a master's degree and a bachelor's degree from an R1 institution, and who now leads the state university. So I've worked in public and private. I understand this space, and I've led institutions in multiple states. That is a background that I think is important right now. If we want to, and I'm going to say this, we got to come up with a broadened definition of workforce development. Workforce development is not just what happens at the two-year level. Workforce development is the law degree. Workforce development is the nursing degree. Workforce development is the welding degree. As I often tell folks, you got to have a job to buy the tofu. It is not just about education of the mind. It is also about helping families change their economic narrative. Is about family growth. It is about all the things we know about why we choose to live in educated communities. So we've got to recognize that workforce development is the purview of all of the institutions of which we have in NSHE. And then it also is incumbent upon us to figure out how we do the work. Now, here's the dirty secret in here. Part of this also means different mission differentiation, which we have not mastered very well in the state of Nevada. We have to come up with a substantive conversation about what that looks like. That's going to make a couple of us uncomfortable. But it's essential, because how do you talk about a funding formula when you don't talk about mission differentiation, when you don't talk about what it means, service areas? Those are very important parts of the conversation. There's Dearian. There's all that they just kind of got said, so I'm done.
Do my colleagues have any? Yes, ma'am, Ms. Williams.
I'm so excited to see you here today.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for your work. We have, in our work with youth in CCST in particular, many of our African American students have expressed the support that they feel when they attend your university, and that they thrive. Also, and I'm getting a little emotional, so forgive me for that.
Okay.
The mentoring programs that you have and the wraparound services that you provide them. And I see so many of our African American kids struggle to feel accepted, even at high school, middle school, elementary school, and to have a place where they feel like they belong. So I just want to give a shout out, and to Mr. Christensen too, for all his support over the years of that institution being there. But I see many of the kids, and to see that number, many of our kids, first generation, attending that college. So I want to ask you, how does the additional support that you have to give kids underserved historically, how does that impact your budget? The amount of money that you have to spend to lift them up, to support them, to keep them in school. We have attendance issues now. how do you keep them coming back and attending, and what kind of services are necessary for them to continue to thrive and to be able to change people's lives and families' lives and lift those families out of poverty, because that's going to change Nevada. So thank you again, and I apologize, all the colleagues. I'm all crying.
No, thank you for your observation. This is a deeply personal subject for me. I'm a first-generation college student. I would not be sitting here if it were not for a library that was about 5 blocks from my house, a praying church community, and robust support services. I'm a TRIO girl. So I'm here because I had a TRIO program that I was actively engaged with. And I would tell you that those truths of Darian, who grew up, a child born in 1970, to a student who may be born in 2010 and now attending Nevada State University, the reality is that they need the same sorts of things, but it takes resources, right? So they need to go into a classroom where they see faculty who are there to teach and who want to be there to support them. And dare I say, faculty whose lived experiences may be similar to theirs or look like them. That means something to walk into a space and see that. It requires that you get to sit down and talk to a student in the hallway. We had a wonderful mentoring event, and we brought students in to sit down at a table and just talk to Gloria, just talk to Darian, and to understand, because when they see us as fully made. Right? They think that I was born with a PhD, right? They think that I became a college president from the moment I walked in. They don't know I almost fell out of college 3 or 4 times. They don't know that, right? They don't know that I was on Pell Grant. They don't know that I was on FAFSA. So these are the things that are essential to that. And what I would offer to you is that it requires intentional design in an institution. And it also recognizes that this mission is important. There are so many students who don't even know that college is a possibility for them. So this idea of having support services when they walk in the door that names them, sees them, and actualizes for them what this process can look like and walks with them and helps them understand about what it means to take out a loan or not, what it means that you may choose to go and take 9 credits instead of 12, what that means to help them coordinate transportation, what it means to go back and explain to your family that you're going to make a decision to go to college instead of doing X, Y, or Z. All of this is a part of those support services and being deliberate about that. When you have to make a choice between being hungry and not. Students who are couch surfing. This is things that happen all the time with our student body. So it is people. We are a people-heavy business. We don't make widgets or light bulbs. I need people. And right now, our funding formula does not provide enough people to do the job because that takes time. And that's a part of the reality that we have to address. So I think Nevada State is unique. I'd like to say that we are designed and we're trying to redesign constantly to meet the needs of students in this space. And thank you for understanding who we are.
Can you give us an idea of maybe, I know all of our universities try to do a good job of supporting our students, but how does that impact your budget? Those
Well, as I said,
extra things that you have to do to
you don't have the
help them thrive.
flexibility with the budget. So as I indicated, we have about 70% of our budget that goes directly to instruction, student support services, academic support service, and scholarships. That's 70%. That still means, though, we got to handle the utilities. That means we're less in this space. We are thinking deliberately about, well, now, how do we offer more evening programming? So how do you shift? We don't have the staffing for that. The other thing is professional development for employees to understand who today's students are and the resources that are necessary for that. But right now, we're literally doing what we can to get by. We're not thinking and redesigning for innovation, and that, I think, is the real challenge.
The chairman asked each of you to provide some recommendations.
Yes.
Could you kind
I
of
would be
address
happy
that
to.
a little bit more
I would be
with
happy
some
to.
dollar
I would
numbers,
be
some
happy
numbers?
to.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, Assemblywoman.
Thank you, Chair. And I don't want to be redundant, but I think it's important to be on the record. You know, I'm Pell eligible, first gen grad and undergraduate degree from Massachusetts. So I appreciate it. I wanted to be on this committee for the conversation of input plus output together. And when I think about all of our schools across the whole state, we know that we have students like Jessica at every institution across Nevada. So really thinking about a granular point. In the K-12 system, we have the per pupil formula that has the weights, so we can make sure that student demographics get more money for certain things in their demographics. Is that something that you think you would support, and could you talk about that?
Yeah, I love this notion. A couple of you in preparation for today's conversation posed a similar question to me. And I think that if you look at the K-12 space, we often say the dollars follow the student, right? I'm of the opinion that that might be an opportunity for us to think about that here. Now, how that looks is going to be different because and in theory, you know, I pulled out our funding formula not too long ago to kind of look at this, and I said, well, we do have some of this differentiation now. We say, you know, lower division, upper division, and we call it masters and doctors. They're different there. We have different clusters where we add nuances to it, but what is probably lost in that is some recognition that the students are going to need a level of support that is not captured just by looking at an academic disciplinary perspective about their lived experience. So I would be supportive of that because but we have to be clear about how we define what that per pupil cost is. And that's where I think the shades of gray happen. But yes, Assemblymember Mosca, I would be supportive of that.
Anybody in Carson City have any questions for the president? Yes.
Yeah, this is Peter Reed for the record, and President Pollard, thank you so much for your presentation. I was struck by the point that you made that our funding formula was designed with regard to a traditional student, and that increasingly across the system we're supporting non-traditional students. And one of your recommendations that I'd love to hear a little bit more about is this idea of fully funding summer, because I think that's potentially an opportunity to increase flexibility, increase accessibility, and kind of meet students where they are and getting them opportunities beyond the strictures of the traditional semester. But I don't know what that would look like in the funding formula given the way it's currently structured. So could you just share a little bit more about your thoughts on summer funding?
Sure. Thank you for lifting that up because right now summer is primarily funded in some targeted areas, I believe primarily teaching and nursing and maybe a few other specialty areas at a much smaller level. But as you are lifting up in your commentary, many of our students, if they are attending part-time, they're able to maximize their load by going fall, spring, and summer. They can take more classes, and we can design institutional experiences more directly for them. But if we aren't able to design or offer summer courses for them, that means they're taking longer to degree completion. So would it be a wonderful opportunity for us to explore? And again, there are many models across the country about this, but it is, again, as President Sandoval brought up earlier, it is fundamentally deciding that the pie is going to have to be a little bit larger, and then we're going to have to open it up a little bit to say this is who our students are right now. Our students are not primarily at Nevada State and many institutions across this state attending full-time. They're attending part-time. And if they have to put a pause in education because there are not courses offered in their discipline, in their major, to help them stay on that pathway, many of them may not be able to graduate within the timelines that we need or may have to opt out because they just say, look, I can never be able to complete this degree.
Any other questions in Carson City? Okay, seeing none, President Pollard, thank you so much for being here. Dr. Walker, nice to meet you. And we'll invite your input, further input to the construction of the formula and things you feel we should be thinking about.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen and members of the committee, it's 2 o'clock, and agenda item number 7 calls for a presentation to the committee by HCM Strategist, who is the vendor that was selected to assist us in the work that we are doing. They have to leave, and I want to be sure we get this presentation in. So I want to give them the opportunity to make that and invite them to come forward, and we'll open up agenda item number 7 for their presentation and your questions. I think it's critical that they get an opportunity to tell you what they're planning to do and how they're approaching it, and then we can return to some of the community college presentations. Now, I do want to mention that we may have to conclude our meeting today at 4 o'clock. That tells me that we may not make it through all of the community college presentations. I mean no disrespect, I apologize. It's just been a lot of information and a lot of questions appropriately from our committee members. If any community college would prefer to make their presentation at our next meeting on March 16th, you're welcome to let our staff know, and we will look forward to having you do so then. I'm just inviting those who might be able to defer until the 16th. I mean no disrespect at all. We want to hear from all of you, and we are especially interested in having you do the same thing I've asked the other presidents to do, and that's to offer suggestions about what the formula should look like. If you do come back on the 16th, and I'm going to ask all the presidents to come back to address these questions, I would hope that you would reflect on these questions that you've heard from committee members and these presentations. Particularly, one area was the community college transition to college issues that have been raised, and get your thoughts and approach on that. I would also add that to the extent that we might entertain a formula, and I'm not suggesting the committee has had any discussions on this, so I have no idea what they would do, but if it were constructed around enhancements instead of base budget, how would that affect your institution? How is it affecting it now? Getting some specific real-life examples like those that have been developed by Ms. Williams, Mr. Christensen, and others on the committee. I think that helps a lot. I think Senator Buck asked a great question about, I'm a policymaker, can you quantify this for me? How does that work? I think that would be very useful testimony in this process. So if you're a community college who's here to make a presentation, I thank you for being here. If you have time and you can defer to the 16th, please let, the 19th, my apologies, March 19th. Please let Crystal or Heidi know, and we'll just take you off. And so with that, let me introduce the folks from HCM Strategists who are going to be consulting with us on this effort. Ms. Snyder, Mr. Carroll, Mr. Johnson, please proceed. Thank you for being here with us.
Great. Good afternoon. Thank you, Chair and members of the committee. Appreciate the opportunity to present to you today. This is the first of what I anticipate to be at least a couple, if not many, engagements with you throughout this process. We were just asked to give kind of a high-level overview of who is HCM. Our work at a national level, working in multiple states on issues similar to those that have been already put on the table today, but particularly working with states on development of funding models to support a diverse set of institutions and in support of state priorities and objectives. So next slide, please. You can go back to the agenda. Just quick in terms of the agenda, we'll give a little bit of context of who we are. Won't belabor that too much, but particularly looking at how we anticipate approaching the review of Nevada's funding model and the other elements of the scope to which we provided. As noted, we will do some national context in terms of the work that we've done in states, what we're seeing in trends around state formula development, a little bit of a focus there on outcomes-based aspects of funding formulas, and then a little bit more detail on our review process. Next slide. So HCM is a public policy consulting firm. We are located all over the country. I actually hail from Buffalo, New York. So I was really hoping to be here yesterday for different purposes, but that did not come to fruition. But we have worked in a variety of different states on issues related to post-secondary access and success, with a particular expertise in post-secondary finance and affordability issues. Next slide. We really meet states where they are. We have been in practice for 15 years. Again, working, we can go to the next slide actually, in terms of just our scope, in terms of where we have touched down in states on a variety of different issues as noted, but particularly focused in on issues related to student success with a particular focus on equity. Our strategic finance work, I'll spend just a second on this slide. This shows the other states and entities that we've worked in. Most recently, actually currently working in Illinois on the Commission for Adequate and Equitable University Funding. We consulted with the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board on the recent reforms to community college funding in that state that resulted in $683 million increased investment for community colleges in that state, driven through both supports on the front end for students as well as on the back end in terms of supporting outcomes. And have worked in the Oregon, with the Oregon Higher Education Coordinating Commission on development of both their university and community college funding models, among other state engagements. So the HCM team, 3 of us here before you today. We are also supported by Katie Lynn Morton, who will be our project manager. She will make sure that we get all of the materials to you in advance and on time, coordinating with the chair, Crystal and Heidi and other staff to support the needs of the committee. And then Brene Smith, who is will be providing research support for our efforts. So our scope of work has kind of 3 broad components, and we'll dive into each of these a little bit further on in the presentation. But we will be presenting and working on evaluating other state funding models. Will be a little bit of that today, but certainly some of the topics that were raised today, I think we can provide more context in some of those particulars in terms of how states approach and are addressing some of the issues related to adequacy, costs, student need, et cetera. Certainly in that context, doing a more deep assessment of the current funding model in Nevada, put forward by any principles or objectives you'd like us to review. And then the other aspect of our scope, somewhat separate, but certainly relevant, is the evaluation of practices and protocols for self-supporting accounts. And again, we'll provide a little bit more detail on what we anticipate that review looking like. Next slide. So the evaluation of other funding formulas, again, we'll review some common higher education practices as it relates to funding models, trends and assessments of best practices. Again, I think we have a running list of topics that have been presented today that we're happy to provide feedback on, specifically in how we're seeing other states approach those challenges and issues. And then certainly we'll develop kind of a comprehensive matrix for you to have as a reference point related to priorities for your funding formula review. Related to that, we will do a deeper assessment of the funding models and history and resource documents. We've already been provided some around the current Nevada funding formula. Looking at funding trends and impacts, some of the topics that have been discussed today, the challenges that have been identified, how the outcomes are impacting different institutions, perhaps accentuating or focusing on some need for mission differentiation. And then a very large part of our scope, or a significant part of our scope, is doing stakeholder interviews. And we will be interviewing each of the members of the committee, as well as representatives from each of the public sector campuses, to inform our review and try to enhance the funding model. And then Nate can certainly talk a little bit more to the third piece around the self-supporting accounts, but we will look at best practices nationally around how states identify and report on self-supporting accounts, understanding what those resources are used for, just in an effort to provide some more transparency and understanding to the stakeholders around the use of those accounts and how they impact capacity of institutions. So I'll turn it over to Will to walk through some of the national context on state funding models. Yep.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Will Carroll with HCM Strategists. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. So as Martha mentioned, we're going to go a little bit into state funding formula overviews. Obviously, the first piece of the scope of our work is to examine common approaches to higher education finance across the country and sort of see how Nevada fits into some of the different common elements. So we'll go through, HCM has, as Martha also alluded to, lots of direct experience working with states, and as part of that, we also just build up a large content knowledge of how pretty much all 50 states are addressing their funding formulas and their finance systems. So what we've seen is those fall into sort of three main approaches to funding. Right? There's a base plus, there's an enrollment-driven, and then there's outcomes-based funding. And so those are sort of the three major buckets that we see coming into play. There's actually 12 systems across the 50 states that have no sort of formula-driven funding system at all, in which case the appropriations are mostly just driven through the legislative process. But within those three main approaches, base plus, enrollment, and OVF, we see lots of different sort of nuances within it. Weights for different courses or students, small institution adjustments, special line items for research or other approaches, which Nevada has utilized quite a bit, as we've heard. Each of the three approaches really has some strengths and some pros and some cons, and so we'll talk a little bit about each of those. And it also, those pros and cons really lend themselves to being used in combination, and we'll see a number of examples of states that have how they've combined those different approaches to sort of make the most of all the different incentives and strengths. So, let's get Nate. Let's jump back to the one more. Yep. No, back up two. One more. There we go. So on base plus, this is basically what you got last year, plus or minus a little bit, and this is definitely the most common approach. Almost every state has some element of a base plus, although Nevada is a little bit unique in that it does not use any sort of base continuing from year to year. One of the major questions, though, in this is sort of how much of the base is protected from year to year, and that varies quite widely across different states. The big sort of incentive or strength of the base is stability. Institutions have a good sense of what they're going to be getting in their budget from year to year, but this does sort of have inequities potentially built into it that can grow over time. Institutions change over time, as we've heard in a lot of the presentations. Programs change over time, and so the base plus model can really sort of lack dynamity, dynamic adaptation to that approach. So it's not responsive to some of those changes that we see. Enrollment-driven funding formulas, this is often just driven on the number of students who are enrolled. In the two-year sector, this is a really common approach across the country. 70% of two-year sectors have an enrollment-driven funding formula approach. Within the four-year sector, it's only closer to about 40% use some sort of enrollment-driven approach. And one of the big questions that states grapple with in this is sort of who are you counting among the enrollment? We've talked about how it's in-state students within Nevada's system, but that is a big question that states grapple with. The pro here is that it directs resources to where the students are. The sort of dollars follow the student. The sort of disadvantage here is that it can be volatile. Student enrollment can be volatile, as we saw during COVID, and institutional budgets are not always as adaptable or fast to change. Costs can be locked in over time. So it also doesn't necessarily incentivize student success. Sort of a number of students in the seats is the main driver there. So if it's easier to recruit a new student as opposed to retain a new student, that is sort of one of the incentives that shows up in enrollment-driven funding. Let's go to the next slide. So weighted student funding, this is additional weights for different types of students, different types of programs. One example is obviously Nevada's weighted student credit hour approach. We do see common populations such as adults, underrepresented minority students, low income are pretty common groups that receive weights in weighted enrollment-driven funding formulas. This can allow the state to identify both students and programs that are higher cost and therefore schools need more resources for. It can also be a way to direct resources to places where there's a particular state priority, either in closing an achievement gap for a particular group of students or for a particular program discipline area where there's a need for strategic growth. The sort of cons are, it's pretty similar in terms of pure enrollment-driven funding formulas. And also doesn't sort of have the sort of student success incentives built into it. Which then leads to outcomes-based funding. About 30% of systems across the country use some sort of outcomes-based funding. That amount ranges, from 5 to 100%, as we heard earlier. Nevada's is about 20%. Really, only a handful of states are above the 20% mark. There are a couple states that use it for almost their entire allocation, but most are more in that 10% range. OBF is a way to sort of make sure that state priorities are being focused and prioritized in funding formulas. It creates incentives for those institutions to focus on those outcomes. It really was one of the first models when it was first developed a number of decades back to sort of focus on different student characteristics and ways to account for their different needs. It does have sort of a potential to create some incentives for making sure, if it is not appropriately accounting for different students, building in weights for equity populations or historically underserved populations, there can be some disincentives to enroll those students. But research has definitely found that with those sort of metrics built in to create incentives to serve those populations, that mitigates any sort of disincentives within those systems. So let's go to the next slide. So, states are using these in combination. There's sort of a number of states that sort of try to create the balance of these different incentives and different strengths. We see a lot of states that we're working in considering how to sort of find the right mix of these three different approaches. Also trying to supplement a little bit with sort of mission-specific aspects related to funding medical school, research funding, medical schools, et cetera. So just a quick walkthrough of a couple examples we have here. Louisiana, within both sectors, they use a base plus. They use a weighted enrollment cost, weighted enrollment based on the cost of the program. They also have a sort of student credit hour weighted by discipline. And they also weight enrollment by student, different types of students, and they even have a concentration factor. So the higher the enrollment of disadvantaged populations at a school, the sort of additional weights are added to those enrollments. And they also have an outcomes-based funding formula. They do have a workforce metric that's a little bit unique that I wanted to just highlight, which is that they sort of have a number of graduates in fields that are linked to, they have a statewide system of job star rating. 4- and 5-star jobs are sort of high demand, high wage jobs, so they have a metric related to that. And they also have these sort of student population characteristics built in so that completion of degrees for adult, Pell, and underrepresented minorities are part of their OBF formula as well. One thing I want to highlight about Texas in particular, their contact hours for their weighted enrollment cost is weighted by the course discipline. They also have this pretty unique lean into, again, the workforce, the sort of return on investment or the outcomes for students in their outcomes-based funding. So they're looking at both the number of credentials awarded and then also the return on investment in terms of wage that students are getting from some of those credentials as a potential metric that they are using that metric right now. They're also one state that has, as Martha alluded to, they generated a large investment in their recent legislative session for their new formula, partly because they were able to sort of identify, I think in part because they lean into identifying what is sort of a minimum guarantee level of funding for every institution and looking at how state and local resources combine to meet that sort of minimum guarantee. Next slide. Minnesota, again, just another good example of going all the way across in terms of the different approaches. One thing I want to highlight here is that they use a mix of both FTE and headcount enrollment in their mix, in their enrollment-driven formula. We see that in Pennsylvania and a number of other states as well that are starting to look at headcount in addition to FTE, sort of in recognition that part-time students also have a sort of similar demand for services and supports. And hopefully the Nevada representation looks pretty familiar to you all after you're digging into the formula. Weighted enrollment by cost in terms of the weighted student credit hour, and then an outcomes-based funding formula that looks at degrees, research, transfer, and has metrics built in for underrepresented minorities and Pell completions. So I'll just, before I hand it back to Martha to dig into outcomes-based funding a little bit more, I just wanted to highlight these trends that we're seeing from other states. We're seeing adequacy be a big conversation. We're working with Illinois and we worked with Texas, and they are sort of looking at research-based ways to identify what is the true cost necessary in order to sort of fund success in the higher education system and fund institutional mission. We're seeing a lot of emphasis on workforce metrics. So, obviously a national conversation about, is higher education worth it? A lot of concerns about debt levels and such. So a lot of states and systems are now looking at what do students make after they leave higher education, how affordable are degrees, a lot of metrics around workforce and value. And then equity, by which we really mean identifying access gaps, achievement gaps among different groups in the state's population, and designing a funding formula that accounts or creates incentives to close some of those gaps. And I think there's an important interplay that Illinois and Texas are really thinking about how, if we're going to hold institutions accountable for some outcomes on the back end, we need to make sure that they're sort of starting from a fair point across the board based on their mix of students and of their institutional missions, so that they need to have the resources up front in a fair way that represents the students they serve to be able to hold accountable for the outcomes that we're looking for as well. So that's sort of a few of the things that we've been seeing, and I'm going to turn it back to Martha.
Great. Martha Snyder for the record. So we were asked to just provide a closer look at the outcomes-based funding trends that we've seen, that we have evaluated across different states. Certainly this is in context of the performance pool conversation that took place earlier today, as well as kind of the review of that component of the funding model. So HCM has done deep research into outcomes-based funding, trying to understand and differentiate across states' approaches to supporting performance or outcomes. Really, this was intended originally not just to inform our actual direct work in states, but also to help understand and provide national context to that not all states, all approaches to outcomes-based funding or performance-based funding are equal. And so to provide some lens of comparison and some principles across which to compare states and their approaches to outcomes-based funding. As was noted by Will, outcomes-based funding is certainly a common component of state funding for post-secondary education. We see at least somewhere between 26 and 34 states at any given time having some portion of their funding focused on outcomes or performance. The intention of this, as we have worked in states, particularly from a policymaker perspective, is to align operating funds with state goals. So as states have shifted and increasingly shifted their focus, not just from access, but from access to be both access and success, as well as an equity perspective within that, including closing gaps and supporting greater access and success for underserved populations. Outcomes-based funding is a common way that states align some portion of their resources or investments in public sector institutions with those goals. Again, a focus on overall attainment, student success measures, as well as those target populations. And states generally have incorporated and developed outcomes-based funding in response to a variety of different circumstances. So the last time we did a formal review of outcomes-based funding in states, and we were in the process of updating this topology or this report and being much more comprehensive to incorporate some of the trends that Will discussed earlier, as well as those different components that we're seeing across states, base, weighted enrollment, et cetera. But the last time we did a comprehensive review of outcomes-based funding in states was fiscal year 2020, so just before the pandemic. And as this map would show, in fiscal year 2020, we've seen some changes here, some additional states added to it, some states that have abandoned their funding, their performance funding models. But for the most part, this map is fairly accurate still. But a very common approach to how states fund, or at least direct a portion of their funds to institutions, is certainly through some aspects of outcomes or performance. Next slide. So as I noted, HCM has developed a topology to understand and try to differentiate between state approaches to outcomes, recognizing that state funding systems vary very significantly in their design, focus, and sophistication of outcomes-based funding. And we developed this topology to range from kind of type 1 or rudimentary approaches to outcomes to type 4 or more advanced approaches. So we'll just kind of click through quickly. I'll just jump between type 1 and type 4. But really type 1 funding models or outcomes-based funding models are those models that are not aligned in any way to state completion or attainment goals. They have a variety of different things that they are trying to achieve, and oftentimes kind of disconnected metrics in doing that. Reliant on new funding only, and I know that has been a discussion today, is should this be kind of a bonus-based approach. But in our assessment, kind of type 1 funding models are those that are reliant only on new funding. The reason for that is because it was actually cited earlier. Oftentimes those can be the first things to get wiped off when tough budget times come. So somehow incorporating it into the core distribution for how the state is supporting institutions is important for sustainability of this focus. An overall low level of funding, under 5%, and certainly we can get into the discussion around what is the magic percentage. The research is not pristine in terms of what exactly is the right amount to be funded, but it's kind of under 5%, the research has shown, does not really drive behavior, does not drive attention, particularly when put in the context of other resources that institutions are operating under, particularly tuition, as tuition becomes an increasingly higher proportion of institutional revenue. Does not differentiate by institutional mission. So there's no differentiation, no opportunity for different institutions to benefit based on the students that they serve, the degrees that they offer, and other mission-related aspects. Total degree completion not included. So oftentimes, these funding models that are type 1 don't focus on degree or credential completion. A target or recapture approach, so giving institutions different targets under which to achieve, and then recapturing resources or funds that were not achieved. And may or may not have been sustained for multiple consecutive years, so kind of a sustainability aspect to this portion of the funding model. If you want to go all the way up to kind of type 4, this shows the differentiation with two tiers or two types in between. So type 1, not aligned. Type 4 obviously would be aligned with completion and attainment goals and related priorities. It is built into the base funding or some recurring aspect of funding for institutions. An overall high level of state funding, we put it at 25% or greater. Again, the research on that is not particularly clear, other than that lower percentages of outcomes-based funding do not sufficiently drive behavior. They differentiate by institutional mission. They focus and prioritize total degree completion with a particular focus on enhancing or focusing on outcomes for underrepresented students. Formula-driven to incent and support continuous improvement. And then these are sustained for 2 or more consecutive fiscal years. So as you'll see on the map here, outcomes-based funding, we did break it out by sector, but we have a strong differentiation, several states still in that kind of type 1 approach. So oftentimes those type 1s are mostly because they are bonus or new money only, and or have no direct connection to supporting degree completion or do not adequately reflect the equity aspects and the needs of underserved students. Up towards type 4 institutions, of which we had in our fiscal year 2020 assessment, Nevada identified as a type 4 funding model. Similarly, in the 2-year sector, you'll see here kind of similar distribution between type 1 and type 4 with Nevada's fiscal year 2020 assessment as a type 4 funding model. The next slide shows, as has been noted, the kind of funding by common metrics. So you'll see North Dakota is technically 100% outcomes-based funding, but only focused on course completion, going all the way down to Michigan. This was a discussion earlier. What is that range? Michigan, you can barely see the amount focused on outcomes because it's less than 1% of their overall funding. With Nevada kind of in the top range of overall funding across course completion or weighted credit hours in this case, progression and degree completion, mission, and then other aspects of the funding formula. Next slide. Just a little bit on kind of common metrics that are most aligned with attainment and equity. So the most common are degrees and certificates being included in funding models, sometimes with weights for prioritization of different degrees or different certificates that have value or demand in the state. Progression-based metrics, in the case, oftentimes credit accumulation, retention type metrics, transfer, so students transferring from 2-year to 4-year and supporting giving institutions, community colleges, recognition of the successful transfer of students into the 4-year, and then in some cases enhancing the priority of those students at the 4-year and prioritizing their success. Workforce-related metrics, as have been already discussed today, some efficiency-based metrics, so degrees per 100 FTE, one of the metrics in Nevada's current performance pool, and then the priority funding, both for underrepresented students as well as high-demand degrees. Next slide. So this shows a comparison of OBF, outcomes-based funding metrics, across a set of selected states, and puts in the context Nevada there as well. So you'll see, Kentucky has progression metrics, credit accumulation at the 15, 30, and 60 credit hour, completion-based metrics, efficiency, again, degrees per 100 FTE. Louisiana was a state that was already highlighted in terms of its kind of unique approach to a combination of funding, but within their outcomes-based funding component of their funding model. They too have progression, completion, transfer, the workforce, 4-star jobs aligned, high demand field, and then a research and public service. And just looking down at Nevada, we count the gateway course completion as a progression-based metric. Certainly the focus on completion within the different certificates or credentials and degrees, the transfer, the efficiency degrees per 100 FTE, some reflection of high demand, and then the research and public service components of the funding model. Next slide. The priority populations, again, to promote equity and access and success. The most common are those low-income students, underrepresented minority, academically underprepared students, and adult students. We have seen states where data are available, oftentimes include veterans, first generation, as well as rural students. So certainly this is something we think is critical to any funding model, but particularly a funding model that focuses on outcomes, is to enhance and ensure that there are equity weights embedded within those outcomes. And the types of students that are weighted within those funding models should be based on the needs and priorities of the state, where looking at data to understand where access and outcomes might have gaps and for whom additional supports are necessary. Okay, again, looking at a comparison of those selected states, comparing to Nevada. Nevada has the low income and underrepresented minority. Some states, as noted, do also include adult and academically underprepared student populations. So it is very important to put outcomes-based funding in the context of other funding models or other funding components. As has been presented, hearing from the institutions today, higher education is certainly complicated. Many different stakeholders, different financial drivers and incentives that institutions are responding to. States do have somewhat, comparable demands for higher education in terms of instruction, research, and public service. So ensuring that you are trying to reflect each of those mission-based aspects within the funding model, but certainly differ in how they meet them across different types of institutions. And so as you approach and as we approach the review of this funding model, ensuring that the context of Nevada and the funding model is kind of important both for core funding outcomes as well as determining the role and relative to other funds. So ensuring that we are putting it in the context of Nevada's needs, drawing on our expertise from work in other states, our expertise of national data, and certainly our increased understanding of Nevada's funding model and the higher education system within which it is trying to support. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Will to walk through what our development process will look like as we engage with you on this review.
All right, for the record, Will Carroll again. So Martha alluded to this a little bit, but it's really important to look at the full context of the state's higher ed finance system and all the different revenue sources when we dig into assessing Nevada's funding process and funding formula. So this chart gives a very high level, Nevada compared to the entire United States in terms of the revenue mix for higher education. This is obviously something we can break down in a lot of different ways and would certainly do so going forward. This type of pie chart varies widely across institutions within a state and certainly does here in Nevada as well. But just a couple sort of flags here, right? There's no hospital funding in Nevada, and that there's no local funding, which is often a source for many states, for many institutions in states. So that is sort of unique to Nevada. But again, we will be digging more into how this revenue breaks out and what incentives that creates for institutions as well. Go ahead to the next slide. One of the other processes that we're going to undertake is sort of developing a list of comparison states rather than doing a full 50-state scan, which can be a little bit overwhelming or unfocused or less relevant because some states just, it may have some good ideas, but it is helpful to know what works in a state that is similar to Nevada. So we'll be developing a list of comparison states, looking at the mix of institutions, the governance structure, trends in both enrollment and higher education finance, and that sort of revenue mix as well. And we'll certainly be engaging with the committee to hear its sort of thoughts on comparison states as well. And then finally, just a little bit in terms of some of the guidelines or principles that we usually think about with our formula review process is, really focusing on what are the state priorities to advance in a funding formula and how would a funding model align with and drive those priorities. To avoiding making drastic changes, and that often sort of can fall into both like just what are the reforms you're going to make, but also how are you going to phase it in. So it can be sort of an implementation approach as well, but just wanting to avoid any changes that can really sort of derail progress that's currently underway, and definitely looking at sort of what are the potential implications by modeling out some different scenarios. And then finally, looking at, sort of student focus. How does the funding model reflect the very needs of the institutions, the missions, and the students they're serving, and making sure that we are serving all Nevadans in the funding formula. So that is how a little bit of our process. I think at that point we will pause and open it up to any questions from the committee. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that overview. One of the things that I was concerned about, especially after hearing some of the presentations today, are things like innovation and enhancement that I don't see part of these slides or part of these initiatives within the formulas in other states. You heard, at least from these three institutions, and I suspect we'll hear from the community colleges, that the existing formula, although putting us at the top third, I'll put it, or maybe even higher among other states in the way it's been done, doesn't account for several of the things that are unique to our state. I'd like to hear your thoughts about how we capture that. I think there's an interest on the part of some of the members from their questions, and certainly from the chair, to examine alternatives. So I'd like to hear what you think about some of the comments that were made, some of the issues that are not currently captured in our formula and should be.
Thank you, Chair. This is Nate Johnson for the record. I'll take a stab at this. My main role in this is going to be on the self-supporting accounts part of the analysis. But on the question of innovation, I'll go back to the pie chart slide here. And I think you can probably divide that into three questions. One has to do just with the quantity of support for innovative practices, whether that's in research or instruction or public service, and whether institutions have enough, whether it's distributed the right way.
Or student support.
Or student support, exactly. And I think you'll probably hear from the other institutions as well that they have a combination of needs for ongoing support for things that are already going well and a need to try out new things, whether that's, again, in the area of research or serving students. So that's one, just is the quantity right? Is it distributed right? The second is it going to the right things? Are you supporting things that make sense for Nevada, whether that's the students you serve, the low-income minority students that you're prioritizing, or in the case of research, you had a presentation from the Desert Research Institute. Clearly makes sense in Nevada. A big marine biology magnet, maybe wouldn't be, as appropriate. So is it the right kind of innovation in an area that makes sense for Nevada? And then the third that's also important that I was hearing this from the presidents too, is really about timing, where getting something started before you have the opportunity to start generating revenue from that, whether through tuition or formula results or federal research grants, getting the first thing going in an area. The first desert research project is one that the state may have to pay for before you can start attracting federal funds and private funds, things like that. So quantity, content, and timing. And so the reason I wanted to show this slide is because one thing I like to do when talking about outcomes funding, and I think this is true of the self-supporting accounts question as well, is to think about all sources of funding as forms of performance funding. It's a question of what kinds of incentives, performance are these sources of funding supporting, and then where does the state fit in that? So your piece of the pie, where does that fit in the overall pie? And I included both the United States and the Nevada pictures here because on the one hand, you are the system for Nevada, but Nevada does not operate in a vacuum. Your institutions compete for students, federal research dollars, faculty with institutions outside the state, so as public and private institutions. So it's good to kind of look at the whole federal or U.S. pie as well as the Nevada pie. The tuition and fees piece of it, which is big in both the U.S. and the Nevada context is, between 25 and 30%. That is essentially performance funding for enrollment, specifically for credit hours. The more credit hours students take, the more they tend to have to pay. And it's specifically performance funding for serving students who have money, right? So, you can't pay tuition unless you have some resources. And within that piece of the pie, you've got the tuition and fees question, which goes to the self-supporting accounts. We can get to that. The other piece of the pie that's relevant to the innovation question, I think, is the federal component, which is even bigger on a national basis than state support for higher education. And most of that is federal research grants. And again, there's a lot of support within that for innovation. The quantity is large. But the questions there, I think, for your point, at least on the research side, have to do with the timing of it. If an institution wants to get something started that they haven't done before, as well as with the focus. Are there things that the federal government is not interested in funding that Nevada, wants some support for funding? And most of the federal funding is for scientific research. There are some Department of Education grants, but they pale in comparison to the size of what's available from the National Institutes of Health, Department of Defense, National Science Foundation. So I think, is there a category of grants specifically for innovation? I'm thinking I remember that being in a title, but it's... No. Oh, okay.
Investing in innovation that are first in the world.
Yeah, first in the world. So there is some federal support for that that you might be able to leverage. But again, the order of magnitude relative to the federal support for research is pretty small. So I think it's certainly a question we can return to, both in the outcomes funding and the self-supporting accounts part of this project.
Can you include that in your interviews of the stakeholders that have been listed? I think we have 30 that we're going to conduct interviews for. Okay. I'd like to get some ideas from members of the committee as well as from other stakeholders that you'll be talking to. All right. Are there any questions from the committee members for HCM? Yes, Mr. Christensen.
Glenn Christensen, for the record. My understanding is that most K through 12 education is funded through property taxes. How about higher education? Is it something similar?
So I can start with that answer. So there are states that have local resources that contribute to higher education. It is not the majority of funding, even in states that have local resources. Yes, you can see on the slide. Thank you. The 3%, about 3% of total support for higher education comes from local property taxes, and the vast majority of that is typically in the community college sector. So it is a small overall portion of the higher ed funding picture for any system or state. Obviously, there's variation in terms of the level of support across states coming from local property, but at a national level, it's about 3%.
It's interesting to me because if you add the state numbers and the federal numbers, it's around 51% of the funding in Nevada comes from what I would describe as pretty volatile sources. You have, especially here in Nevada, where we're so dependent on gaming and sales taxes, and then you have different administrations at the federal level. Any number of things can happen. I don't know to what extent, if any, when you're looking at funding formulas, you consider the source of these funds.
So Martha Snyder again for the record. I'll just quickly respond to that, then open it up for Will and Nate to respond as well. For the most part, states are looking only at their investment and how they are allocating that investment. The work that we're currently doing in Illinois is attempting to account for other resources that are flowing into, in that case, the university system. But for the most part, it is an allocation approach for states in terms of how they are investing their state resources into institutions. We are increasingly seeing states start to get at the point of kind of adequacy in the context of higher education. But for the most part, higher ed is oftentimes kind of a balancing wheel of state budgets because of the diversity of resources, rightly or wrongly, that sector has to pull from compared to other aspects of state budgets.
I mean, in contrast, the balance of the United States is like 30% versus our 51%. I'm assuming that we've not done an adequacy study for higher education.
I think that this is Nate Johnson again for the record. The question of the funding sources and the stability is a really good one for this project, and each state has a little bit of a different fingerprint there. I'm from Florida, and I was working there during the Great Recession, and I remember Nevada was one of the states that, like Florida, took a particularly big hit during the Great Recession. Similar kinds of economies, similar reliance on sales tax, tourism, new states, fast-growing universities. So whenever we were kind of doing comparison charts, Nevada was always right there with us. But the advantage, and also we don't have local sales tax or local property tax in Florida either. The advantage of local property taxes is that they don't tend to go down at the same time that state sales taxes do, or that, for that matter, we saw during the Great Recession some of the very wealthy colleges, Harvard and Yale, were particularly hit because the stock market goes down, and they spend a percentage of their endowment. So in some ways, community colleges were a little protected by that. On the other hand, the distributional aspect of property taxes can be pretty uneven across states. So in Oregon, which does have a significant amount of property tax, Portland has a pretty good, property tax base for its community college. Klamath Falls, not so much. So getting that so that it works out to support the students where they are and provide kind of a fair level of resources for the students who need it is another aspect of that. Looking at federal support, aside from the research component, I think since there was a project that showed that since the Nixon administration, I think, every time there had been a recession, regardless of Republicans or Democrats being in control, the federal government had increased support for Pell Grants. So, these are volatile times that might not happen again, depending on what the administration is. But that has been a fairly significant bipartisan consensus during the economic cycle for quite a long time in this country.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Kyle Dalpy. I'm on the committee, but I'm also president of Western Nevada College in Carson City, which is a community college, and I have couple comments and a question. If you could, I'm sure under the scope you'll be watching the March 19th meeting as well, because I have deferred. You're going to be there. Okay, good. Because I've deferred to come to that meeting since I have to be here anyway. We can save some time. I'm looking at your slides, and I'm just curious. I have worked in 3 states, 4 community colleges, 1 university, and I'm looking. 21 years, though, has been here. Some of my background in other states is becoming dated. Talking about community colleges, how many states do not use the local property tax? And I don't know if it's on one of your, I'm looking, I think you said something in here, and I don't need an exact answer. I'm just curious, are we an anomaly or?
I have a map on my computer, but there are kind of 3 categories. There are the no property tax states, which are the majority, actually. And then there is kind of a blended category with some state, some local. And then there's kind of the entirely local category, which is the smallest number. So, but most states do not. So that 3%, is actually concentrated in the states that do. So in those states, it's, it'd be a much bigger part of their individual pie than it is nationally.
Right. Okay. I appreciate that. Yeah. Because one of the things I've noticed in my 21 plus years here and was measured by, said by some of the other presidents is the volatility piece, which you just said as well. And if it's a 9/11, a recession, a pandemic, and we've seen what happens in this town, which I don't even live in Clark County, but I know that everything that happens down here, like big events like yesterday, help the economy. But when you don't have those events and when things go south, it hurts the economy, which we realize in the upcoming legislative session. So that imbalance of revenue that's so dependent on gaming and tourism is, I think, the struggle that's here. Not that I'm advocating for a local tax, but another sustainable revenue source, I think, is something that will need to be looked at some point. Thank you.
Yeah, so good afternoon, and thank you so much for your patience today. We've got a lot of interest, as you can tell, in what's happening. In looking at your presentation, and again, I may know some of this answer. You've heard talk from our universities today about workforce. So that's really a part of our economic development strategies across our state. How about non-credit programs? So that's a significant component for really our community colleges, but also to some degree our other institutions. But where are you capturing any of that information on any of the outcomes-based funding or any of the other funding formula components? Thanks.
Sure. So non-credit is certainly a trend that we are seeing in terms of state funding, understanding how states can better support non-credit education in an effort to align to workforce needs. We can break out what we currently have in terms of states that account for non-credit versus credit. For the most part, state funding formulas up until recently have been particularly only focused on for credit. Both in terms of the enrollment aspect, but also the outcomes components of that. Again, we've increasingly seen states start to be more focused on value. So the recent Texas Community College funding reform kind of blurs that line between credit and non-credit. Similarly, in North Carolina, a recent funding formula that they developed for their community colleges blurs that line between credit and non-credit. So certainly something we can look at and work with you on as we do that review. But for the most part, that FY 2020 analysis is almost entirely for credit, with a few states that started to look at non-credit and support non-credit education. The biggest challenge there oftentimes is data, consistency of data in terms of how institutions are collecting it, and certainly how it is or is not reported to the state.
On your slides, which of the states use this performance pool, like the portion of the funding formula we have here in Nevada? You heard quite a bit of objection about that, and also the fact that it's capturing the institutions are expected to recapture or fight to retain, I guess, a portion of their base budget. But I don't see here where these other states are using that approach. Did I miss something?
Sure. So we can provide additional information in our follow-up to verify which exact states are using a performance pool versus more of a formula allocation. Yeah. So Montana, off the top of my mind, uses a performance pool.
In the same way that Nevada does?
A very similar way to the way that Nevada does. Similarly, Alabama for its community colleges and a pending formula for its universities is taking a performance pool approach. Those are the two states that jump to my mind. Again, I want to go back and provide a more thorough response.
Are the two that come to mind anchored in a reduction of the base budget, or is the performance pool formula something else?
So in Montana, it is a portion. It's a portion of the core appropriation to the institution. So technically, it comes out of the base. That calculation is done a little bit differently than it is here. I think the Nevada calculation of the performance pool is a little unique. Alabama, the community colleges, is a separate appropriation for the performance pool.
I think it would be important to have whatever states use performance pool calculations and compare those with ours. as you say, ours is unique. Maybe those states are unique too, but the whole concept seems to me to be foreign and contrary to what would be a usual incentive that you might see in most private institutions or businesses.
We can follow up with that information.
Okay, thanks. Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Just for thank you, Chair. I appreciate that.
I knew I was going to get a chance to call you.
I have a question, and I'm sorry that I don't know who to exactly pose this to. First, I want to thank you very much for the presentation. I know there's a lot of time and effort that goes into this. So again, thank you for providing us this all of the information. On slide 16, there was a comparison of metrics based on states. And then if you go further down, there's a comparison of OBF metrics. And in both of those metrics, there are states that you're referencing, Louisiana, definitely. And then in Texas, it looks like maybe there was some comparison for sorry, trying to be able to see you as well, the two-year institutions. And then on the OBF metrics, there's Kentucky that's listed. Can you please share with us, based on those states, specifically, we'll just say Louisiana, Kentucky, what was the state-funded amount that was provided to those institutions? And then what was the federal amount that was provided to those institutions?
So Martha Snyder, for the record. Unfortunately, I don't have I don't have it all categorized in my head off the top of my head. Something we can follow up with you on, certainly. I do think that probably the Louisiana funding model is one to look at in terms of comparison between the two states. But we can follow up with that specific information. I do not have the breakdown between state and federal for those two states off the top of my head.
Thank you. I appreciate that. The Sheo Grapevine data, right? What is that data that you would use to, in other words, is that data credible in terms of what you would be presenting to us? Is that a resource that you would use specifically for those financials?
For comparisons, yes.
Thank you. Appreciate your time.
Are there any questions for HCM from Carson City?
Mr. Chairman, this is Rick Combs. I had a question.
Yes. Hi, Rick.
Hi. I had a question regarding the outcome-based funding, the priority populations, and it centers around the academically unprepared. I was wondering if you could comment on how the states that use that, how they measure it. Is it GPA, test scores, anything else I'm not thinking of?
Thank you. Yes. So for the most part, it is test scores, particularly states that have universal requirements for ACT. Use ACT benchmarking as identification for students that are academically underprepared. There are a set of states, Ohio being one of them, that uses assessments on placement exams. They're actually re-examining that, given the student success research of not using placement exams as it is a barrier oftentimes for student access. And then there's a state or two that uses GPA, high school GPA, as a benchmark for academically underprepared. But the states that most commonly use that, it is an ACT benchmark.
Any other questions from Carson City?
Mr. Chair,
I'm not.
Oops, sorry.
Yes, go right ahead.
Amy
Go right
Stevenson,
ahead.
for the record. I was going to go back to slide 17. I'd like to know what
Sure.
the definition of base plus is, because I would argue, because Nevada isn't checked for that, but I would argue that a hefty part of NSHE's funding is the base budget. So I was just curious if we're comparing apples and apples.
Thanks for the question, Will Carroll, for the record. So the definition of base plus is sort of that a guarantee that an institution will get what it got last year without running that amount through some kind of formula. And so the distinction, I think, with Nevada's formula is that the weighted student credit hour, it still goes through. There are a couple pieces carved off first, and then the rest of the funding goes through the weighted student credit hour. So that was why we did not have that identified as a base plus.
Thank you.
Any other questions from Carson City? Just to follow up on Chairman Brooks' question, in Louisiana, what are there state institutions that are R1 research institutions?
Yeah, Louisiana State. I don't know if there's any in the University of Louisiana system, I would imagine.
Lafayette might be R2. Yeah.
So my question there is whether or not the funding formula is altered to account for their research efforts in a formula that's different than ours.
Yeah, there are research aspects or mission-based aspects to the Louisiana funding formula that does include different research or different missions of institutions. Again, we can do a deeper comparison of selected states to do compare, contrast, and dive into each of these isolated issues a little bit more. I think being involved in, or being able to hear today's presentations, we have a running list of kind of topics that were presented that we can, again, kind of dive deeper into to do much more nuanced analysis.
And then the other side of the coin is institutions that are similar to the missions and goals of Nevada State University, which has a whole different dynamic of separate financial needs, having that comparison too.
Absolutely.
Okay. Any other questions? Yes, Ms. Williams.
Yvette Williams, for the record. I just wanted to get back to this underprepared. I know you related it to test scores, but are they looking at it from a standpoint of having to take remedial classes at the institutions?
So there was a time at which states did use placement and remedial education as an identifier for being academically underprepared. They have moved away from that, again, to align with best student success practices, which shows the negative implications of placing students in remedial education versus wraparound supports, co-requisite education, et cetera. So using other external aspects of measuring academically underprepared.
I'm just wondering if it's really capturing those students' needs in a test score, because we do have a large population of students who are not proficient. And I'm just wondering if the test scores are really capturing that and the real true expense to universities and our colleges, our community colleges as well. A lot of our students are needing that remedial. I'm just wondering if they're really capturing, and are we really funding that properly by doing it through test scores?
Sure. Martha Snyder, if I just may comment on that, this is information. This is not kind of necessarily assessment of what our professional expertise would be or recommendations. Agree with you on the limitations, multiple limitations of using test scores. On the kind of reflection of the supports that are necessary for student success, I think bringing some of the work that we've done recently in Illinois around how they are approaching additional supports and costing out additional supports for students, in addition to the way that the Texas Community Colleges is costing out the additional resources necessary for success across different student groups, might be informative to better answer that question.
Okay, any other questions from the committee members? All right, you and we have our work cut out for us. We are grateful you could come today and give us this overview. Lots to look at, and thank you so much for your support. Obviously, stay in touch. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. And committee members, this team will be reaching out to each one of you. I wanted every one of the committee to be interviewed as part of this process, as did Crystal and Heidi and the chancellor. So you'll be getting a call from them. Okay, thank you. We have some time remaining, and I'd like to invite President Saragosa on behalf of CSN to make a presentation. And then what I think we'll do with that is close at the end of that, because we have to provide time for public comment afterwards.
I have some people who need to take.
Okay. It has been suggested to me that we be humane and take a slight break, President. So we'll give it 10 minutes, okay? Okay, ladies and gentlemen, this will be another 2-minute call.
Thank you.
2 minutes and we'll get started.
Thank you. That was needed.
Chair Hardesty, committee members, chancellor, colleagues, and guests, for the record, I'm Federico Zaragoza, president of the College of Southern Nevada, also known as CSN. With me today is Rolando Mosqueda. He's the vice president of finance and administration at CSN. And thank you for this opportunity to present information on CSN and to share our thoughts and observations, as well as recommendations on both our budget priorities and on the higher education funding formula. I also want to acknowledge that you've got tremendous information today from the previous presidents, and I can tell you that a lot of what you have heard does apply to community colleges as well. So you'll be hearing some of these themes repeated. But first, I would like to provide an overview of the demographics of the College of Southern Nevada. It speaks to who we are and why we exist. So CSN is a large and diverse, comprehensive community college, and the emphasis is on community. Our student body and programs are as diverse as the community that we serve.
The day of my orientation, I met my mentor, Shelley Keller. She changed my life. At the College of Southern Nevada, I received the support I desperately.
We're having a few technical difficulties. Yeah, and we're going to skip. Okay, I'm going to continue with that, if that's okay. And I don't know if it comes back on, we'll figure it out, right? Okay. So again, I first wanted to talk a little bit about the demographics of the College of Southern Nevada. As I've indicated, we're a community college, and the emphasis for us is always on community. Our student body and programs are as diverse as the community we serve. We are a majority minority and Hispanic serving institution. 69% of our students are students of color. 40% of our students are Hispanic. 11% are African American, and 10% are Asian. 57% of our students are female, and the average age of our students is now 25. 73% of our students attend part-time. We offer over 105 degree pathway programs and a robust college transfer program as well. And I want to emphasize that about half of the students that come to the College of Southern Nevada come with the objective of transferring to universities, and the other half come because they want to go into the workforce or they have to go into the workforce. So our programs kind of reflect those pathways and what we need for our students to succeed. We have 3 major campuses. One is located in the city of North Las Vegas. A second campus is located in Henderson, and our Charleston campus is located in the city of Las Vegas. In addition, we have 8 learning centers located throughout Southern Nevada to ensure access throughout the community. Our access is a point of pride. EMSI just conducted a review, economic impact of CSN, and one of the areas that they found was that 1 in 74 workers in Southern Nevada is a CSN alumni. So we have a vast reach into the workforce, and that's a tribute to our programs and to the faculty at CSN. Our annual student head count is approximately 48,000 students, 6,800 non-credit, which currently are not funded in any way through the funding formula, and 41,000 unduplicated unique credit students. We employ a total of 1,900 employees, and about 1,200 are full-time. In terms of scale, even after the COVID decline, CSN has more students than all of the other NSHE community colleges combined. CSN is one of the largest comprehensive community colleges in the country, and depending how you count, anywhere from 5 to 15. So I wanted to give you a sense of scale in terms of the College of Southern Nevada. I want to talk to you a little bit now about our mission because it's directed, it's powerful. You know, we empower our students and our communities, and it's not just to students and communities, to achieve, which for us means they learn, and we measure that to make sure that they're in fact learning, that they succeed, and that means they're graduating or transferring, and they're getting into the workforce at some point, and they prosper. And that means that there is a return on investment, whether it be going on to the university or a family-sustaining job in the workforce. Our mission is not just words, it's who we are and why we exist. It has been our North Star that has guided us through difficult times. In fact, the Northwest Commission on Colleges and Universities commended us on this very point. They gave us 3 commendations specifically related to our mission. One is our student-first focus. Whatever resources we have are first allocated to the lenses of student. The second is our partnerships with our community, with our businesses. And that's reflected in placement levels, that's reflected in partnerships. And when you talk about workforce and economic development, the College of Southern Nevada is there to diversify the workforce. That includes partnerships, that includes the new Deborah March Advanced Manufacturing Center of Excellence, which was funded primarily by the City of Henderson. It includes partnerships with the City of Las Vegas and of various municipalities that I can go into at some other time. But it was recognized by the Commission as a very unique and positive element of our mission. And then thirdly, that we provide the support to our students that are in core requisite programs. That question has been posed, and I want to just very quickly touch on that. And that is that while students now can go into these core requisite programs, it doesn't mean that they're ready. And it often means that they need additional support, and it often means that for community colleges like CSN, that we have to prioritize our resources to support those students with kind of the enrichment and support services and wraparound services that you might have heard. Because as you also know, many of our students discontinue or drop out, not because of academic reasons, but because life happens, and they need those support systems that Dr. Pollard so adequately talked about. I have suggested the current funding formula does not work well at CSN for several reasons, but more particularly during times of declining enrollment. And I just wanted to give you an example of what this means to the College of Southern Nevada. So first and foremost, I wanted to give you a sense of my experience in the budgeting process, and that's looking at about a $12 million net budget adjustment that I had to deal with. That's after we've used every other resource that we had. That's after we've used some of the recovery funds that we had. We still had a $12 million gap. And some of that was related to budget programming, and the other one was the COLA. And the COLA was a very positive action that we took. It was very needed. And I want to commend our students, because I think our students came forward, and they, part of this formula was that they were going to pay a 5% increase or fee to support this COLA increase. So that's why I said mine was a net $12 million. It includes those type of projections. But this is what we had to do. So now we are sustainable. We're where we need to be. We have a budget that we can maintain over time, but we had to reduce 141 positions. So those positions were reviewed, not all were filled, but we have had to realign our capacity to our resources. And again, in eras of declining enrollment, obviously there is hurt in the process. We've been through that. We did it through a collaborative process. But I wanted to emphasize that this is real work that is happening, and we do have declining enrollment. There is a real pressure that's put on the institutions that will have consequences in terms of our ability to serve our students. And I want to give you another kind of slide that talks about the budget. So if you look at the colleges of Nevada, we always compare ourselves to our peers. And here you see that for CSN, our first cut has to be to fund the classes that we offer, right? So we have about 5,000 sections that we have to budget for every year. That accounts for 46% of our budget. And that's higher, that's that orange line, that's higher than any one of our peers. And that's a reflection of how we spend our money. We get our money, we provide instruction, and so we fund the instructional component first. What's left over then is allocated to the various other line items, and I will emphasize that in every one of those line items, CSN has less resources than the mean for our peers. And in some cases, we are kind of the institution that spends the least money, not because we don't have the need, and I'll emphasize, I want to emphasize maybe the student services line, where, it's not that we don't want to spend more, we don't have the resources to spend more. In fact, I already know that in this particular area, we want to be at 350 to 1. That's the goal that the board set for us in terms of advisors. We're more like 500 to 1. So that is the environment oftentimes that we're in part because of the funding formula. So I want to talk about the funding formula. First and foremost, this is not an equity formula. And again, the concept of equity is well rooted in American society. This is well rooted in policy discussions, and you just heard a presentation that spoke to funding formulas. I want you to think about the concept of equity and not so much the numbers. There's going to be all kinds of combinations of how you create an equitable funding formula. But at the end of the day, you want to ask yourself, does it address the needs that those institutions, or the students that those institutions are serving? So you've already heard, in our particular case, we're a majority minority institution. I want to tell you another piece of information here. About 70% of the students that are coming to CSN are not college ready. 70% of the students that come to CSN require enriched remediation within the core requisite model. And those students that are in fact staying the course in the core requisite system. So there are significant needs that are not being addressed. And because we're an output system, who you bring in the front door doesn't really matter. And I want to emphasize that at community colleges, those students that come in our front door are individuals that have economic needs. You heard the term Pell eligible. They're poor. They're individuals that come from poor performing schools. They're individuals that have academic needs. And we need a funding formula that is equitable and that recognizes at the front end the services that these students are going to need. Or you're going to have a president here standing before you telling you, I wish I could hire more advisors because my students need it. The second part that I want to talk about, again, is that, again, we're an output formula. So I've got 74% of my students are part-time students. Every student that walks in the door needs to go through onboarding services, whether you're full-time or part-time. We do not get funded on what happens at the front end of the process. We only get funded on the number of courses that are completed satisfactorily. Our students oftentimes, you use the term between FTE and headcount. Here's the difference. Headcount means that you count an individual when he gets in the door, and if he comes from one course, you count him once. It takes 3 individuals, it's 9 to 12 credits to be an FTE. So if you're a part-time student and you're taking 1 course, it takes 3 students to equal 1 FTE. And yet the services that you have to provide have to be equitable. So again, I want to just emphasize the need to look at the input side of the house, not just at the output side of the house. You've heard the conversation about credit and non-credit. I just want you to be very clear when we talk about equity, that 80% of those students that are in the non-credit programs are individuals that have high academic needs, many of which have not completed a high school diploma. Many of them have literacy needs. We have a high pocket of immigrants, and many of them are coming just because they need a job. They need short-term training. They have to get into the workforce. This component is not supported by the funding formula either. Other places like Texas, by the way, the reason that they're doing the workforce part of it is because many of these individuals need to have that first tier into the workforce. So it's very important that we have the capacity to serve populations basically that are not only non-traditional, but they need high support systems and a pathway into the workforce. And obviously, for many of them, a pathway to get that high school diploma. There's 200,000 individuals in Southern Nevada, as we speak now, without a high school diploma. Community colleges in many parts of the country is a segue for that population to get into the mainstream, and we want to be part of that discussion. The issue has come up about kind of workforce and being able to meet the needs. So I'm going to give you a couple of facts. All of us have waiting lists in our colleges. It's not we don't have the students. All of us have waiting lists. The funding formula, actually, we have to subsidize every nursing student. This is across the board by taxing the other students to be able to serve those that are currently in the system. If we had additional funding, and our recommendation has been to double, go from a weight of 2 to a weight of 4, so that we can, in fact, at least cover the cost of nursing and be able to add more sections. So there are things that we can do in the workforce space if the funding formula were better aligned to the objectives that we see coming forward from the broader community. And then you've already heard the conversation, the performance pool. You know, we got the Beacon Award in student success from our accreditors just last year, and we underperformed. How can we be one of the most successful in terms of increasing student success and yet not meet those targets? That's because we lost 4,000 students with the pandemic. And across the country, urban areas was particularly hard hit, and we're no exception. So I wanted to just kind of give you a high-level overview of what the funding formula means in real life to a community college, and at least the College of Nevada. And I guarantee you that my colleagues will enrich this for you in terms of information. How do we spend our money? So in the budget, we're asking for additional funding, and if you know 80% of that is solely in the student success area, 67% specifically as it relates to graduation and retention, and then with 13% for access, 11% for closing the gaps. And then the workforce is at 9%. And this is how the programs are distributed, so I know exactly what I need. I actually need about $20 million to fill kind of some of the gaps that we have within the College of Southern Nevada. And the $9 million, by the way, is for a 1 year. So for the biennium, it would be about $20 million. And you see that that would impact 18,000 students. That's my gap now. And I guarantee you that with these if the funding formula would allow us to have these resources at the front end, we would be doing some amazing things in this community. And so I'll just conclude with the next 2 slides. These last 2 slides talk about our function on access. And since I came to the College of Southern Nevada, and I understand many of you actually grew up, there's a sign that in the northern corridor of this community that says the future site of the CSN campus. If we don't build a facility this year, we're going to lose that land. Fortunately, last session, we were able to get a planning grant. And so there is now a planning grant to build the first building, not a full campus, of the first building of what would be the Northwest Campus component, and that would be our Center of Public Excellence in Public Safety. And again, that would be supporting a lot of our existing programs. We currently have a police science program, an EMT program, a fire science, a paramedic, but they're scattered throughout the community. This would allow us to provide an environment and also a model of not serving just the pipeline preparing, but also the incumbent needs, the needs of existing public service officers to address some of their mental health and professional development needs. And we're working in partnership with all of the Southern Nevada community, so we're very encouraged. We're hopeful that this legislature will allow us to move forward. And then the last component, I won't get too much into this. I know the chancellor probably has a lot more to talk about this as this process continues, but campus safety is very important to us. We have about a $4.2 million gap without even looking at the officer component, everything from access to the doors to the camera systems, et cetera. And again, our funding formulas don't even allow us to get beyond the basics that I talked about when I started my slides. Mr. Chairman, that constitutes my report, and I'm glad to answer any questions.
Excellent overview, President. Thank you. I hope you didn't feel rushed in presenting that. And
Mr. Chairman, I was worried because when I get rushed, I divert to Spanish.
Wow. Well, that would have been entertaining. Maybe we should try that approach in other contexts. You can argue in front of the legislature, see what they think of that. So you heard presentations from the four-year schools about how do we construct a formula that takes the transition of your students into their universities. What do you think about that? How would that be configured? Do you have some thoughts there?
I sure do. Actually, Dr. Pollard and Dr. Whitfield.
In English.
Yes, sir. Dr. Pollard, Dr. Whitfield, and myself have had several conversations about that particular area, in part because over 30% of their students start at the College of Southern Nevada. And if we had a better support system, we could actually dedicate advisors that could focus on basically the college transfer component, that could do more of the wraparound. I'll give you another example. We have to make up some degrees to be able to not lose us $200,000, right? Related to the performance pool. Part of it is that there's a reverse degree completion component here that we're talking about. All these students that went to the university that were almost there because they averaged 55 credits. So we know I've got a lot of students that transfer over to the university with a lot of credits. Once they complete those courses in the receiving university, in some cases, they could earn the CSN diploma. But we've got to codify all of that. These are systems that already exist, that are in place. And what we need are the resources to be able to, again, focus those pathways. So it's P20, it's not P12 or P14, it's P20. We've got to follow these students as a system. And I think if the funding formula would allow us to do that, it would be a win-win all the way across, not only for the university, the community colleges, but for those students that are coming from the public school systems and from underserved areas in this community.
I imagine your campus is impacted, your college is impacted by just your operating expenses like power and so forth, similar to the way the other universities commented.
Yeah, I believe that the chancellor could attest to that.
Could you
Yes, sir.
share with the committee the impact on your college?
Chair Hardesty, Chancellor Charlton, and committee. For the record, my name is Rolando Mosqueda, and I am Interim Vice President of Finance and Administration at College of Southern Nevada. Since fiscal year 21 to date, and fiscal year 24, our utility costs have risen from a little over $2 million to about $5.9 million. We've realized about 126% increase in utilities, and that's not just power, that is all utilities that the college is responsible for paying.
And so how does the funding formula affect your ability to pay that bill or restrict you from paying support services, for example, or applying the money to other services?
Right, so as shared by the other institutions during today's discussion, there is no specific allotment in the funding formula for utilities, let alone the inflationary pressures of the utilities that we've experienced over the last few years. And so the college has to identify resources internally with institutional funds to make up the difference. And sometimes that will impact our programmatic efforts for our students.
So how would you construct the funding formula to take into account a potentially enhancement-based performance pool as opposed to a base budget performance pool?
I missed the last part of that question, Chairman Hardesty. I apologize.
How would you construct a funding formula that is based on enhancements as opposed to base budget cuts with a...
If I could on that, I'll jump. I'm the president. He's not. Yes, okay. So a couple of thoughts. One, I think you can infuse square footage into the mix. You could infuse a cost of living or utility adjustment factor. So the formula, these are shells. What you've heard are shells.
Right.
What you put into the shell, the variables you identify, are the ones that would get funded. So if this is a concern, I think you would want to talk through how do we incorporate an element that would in fact accommodate the needs of the institutions. I don't know that we'll give you the specifics, but I can tell you that the variables is there and the data is definitely there. I mean, there's also other components like utilization that you can incorporate. There's elements of square footage that's not even usable. So I think that there's a lot of information in this space that needs further discussion. At the end of the day, though, the important thing is to recognize that there's a huge gap. When we talked about the needs, that was tier 1 needs. There were 5 levels of need identified.
Mm-hmm. So you heard me invite the presidents to provide supplemental information. If you're drafting a funding formula, I'd like you to do that and share it with us, because I want to get a sense of the kinds of matrix and what kind of weights you'd attach to those so we can address that.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Any questions from the committee for the president? Yes, Assemblywoman.
Thank you, Chair. And this is really just, thank you for all that you do. Really just your thoughts. Do you feel like you prefer to be in your separate formula, or do you think we should keep them all aligned?
The devil's in the details. I've been in 2 systems. I was in the Wisconsin system, and I've been in the Texas system, and I'm in the Nevada system. There's 3 very, very different systems. There's not an easy answer. I think it's going to be in how it's crafted. And again, when I came to CSNS as students first, I think if the conversation starts with the type of students we have, the kind of institution services we provide, we can back into what makes more sense. But I can tell you the delta is constant. You're still just going to be basically cutting costs between high needs and reprioritizing what you're not going to need. I think part of the discussion is going to be how do we increase the total resources that are there in higher education. You heard the former governor, you've heard everybody, including myself, emphasize this is a time where we can address the real issues at higher education. And we can't continue to operate knowing that we've got huge gaps going into the input, the beginning of the processes.
Any other? Yes, Regent.
Just a point of clarification, the advisor ratio was 350 to 1.
Yes, ma'am.
Not 250 to 1. Just want that on the record so everybody understands.
I'm so sorry.
That's
It's
okay, that's
350 to
okay.
1. Yes.
350 to 1.
Yes, Senator.
Thank you, Chair. I was wondering what percentage of the requested, or the gap, the 20 million, is the percentage of your entire budget? What percentage is that?
And that is, with reference to the number, that was the $20 million. So that would constitute about 15% of our budget.
How are your capital needs funded, President?
Again, for the record, Rolando Mosqueda, Interim Vice President, Finance and Administration, CSN. We are leveraging the HEC check, the deferred maintenance money that is available to all institutions that was referenced in an earlier presentation. So we're using that for our deferred maintenance and our capital construction projects. Right now, currently, there are only one priority capital construction project, and that is the Northwest Campus. And the rest of those are just institutional funds that are supporting our renovations.
Do you have buildings in the same, perhaps not the same situation as President Sandoval mentioned, but I'm sure the upkeep to the buildings you do have is a challenge.
And we have some legacy buildings and some areas that are definitely in need of improvement, similar to UNR discussed earlier.
Okay. What happens to the land you said you're going to only be able to build on portion of it? What happens to the rest of it? Is building on a portion of it sufficient?
Mr. Chairman, so there is a master plan. This will be the first building with the capacity to build 9 more additional buildings depending on need. But what's important is you begin to develop the synergy to expand services. And there probably is going to be an update to the master plan. So this is the first building and the only funded building at this point for the campus. But it does provide the infrastructure for the campus once it's built.
Okay. Are there any? Yes, Chancellor.
So President Zaragoza, thank you for the presentation. As you mentioned, SIP Code 51, which is your health sciences. So as a community college that provides a large healthcare workforce within Southern Nevada, are there challenges because that you're supplementing funding from other programs regarding recruitment and retention of faculty?
Mr. Chairman, through you to the Chancellor, absolutely. And I'd have to go back and check this, but my understanding is we're subsidizing CSN students by $30 per credit. You multiply that by the number of students, and those funds have to come from other revenue sources. Typically, it's from the student fees from that part of the budget. And so we have a scenario where we're having to move funds from one to the other. That's not sustainable. Secondly, we're also in an environment where we just made some COLA adjustments. So it only gets worse. And the irony of it all is that we have waiting lists of students that could get into these programs if we had additional sections. So there's a lot of moving parts to this, but the formula itself is going to cap us at a certain level.
Any other questions for, yes, Mr. Chairman Brooks?
Thank you, Chair. Byron Brooks for the record. Thank you very much. Again, thank you for the presentation, President Zaragoza. I've had enough conversations with you to recognize that this wasn't you being rushed. This is you being passionate and probably frustrated about where we sit with some of these things. There was something that you brought to light that I don't think we have enough conversation about, and that's college readiness. So I want to thank you for bringing that up, because perhaps while we're having this conversation about proper funding, we can make that an element of design in terms of how we get things done. And the other interesting thing that you brought up, and again, we don't talk about enough, is this P through 20 concept, right? So that we actually have a system in the state of Nevada of education where if the community college is going to be a pipeline, we're beginning in that K through 12 process to be able to make sure that we're streaming success for our community members. I just wanted to give you an opportunity real quick if you want, and I thought you did a great job doing it in terms of the award you got based on enrollment and graduation. However, because it's come up specifically regarding the funding formula, I'm wondering if there's anything that you would want to bring to light regarding enrollment versus graduation rates at CSN.
Well, more importantly, I think we have needs on both ends. And I don't want to suggest, just a non-credit element where we've got almost 10,000 students a year that could transition into the credit space. And you're seeing that one of my initiatives that we're proposing for this budget is non-credit to credit migration. So we have the students now to be able to grow the credit side. But again, here we're partitioning students. They're all our students. That's why I say we have 50,000 students, because I count them all. Whether they count for formula is a second issue. The need in this community is great. I mentioned the 200,000 individuals with high school diploma. Many of them are working on their GEDs. And for dual enrollment with high school students earning college credit, we should have GED students with the same opportunity if they're able to. That's called ability to benefit. These are all areas of great opportunity where we just don't have the funding. If we had the funding, we have untapped, underutilized parts of this community that would benefit from higher education. That's the opportunity I think that we can talk about, and I think that that's where we could see some real shift in terms of the community college space, so we can go into some of these areas that are basically the underserved areas. We talked about the high school populations and dual enrollment, but I want to go into the underserved areas of this community, schools that currently don't have a lot of dual enrollment, but they're the ones that can least afford the tuition. So that equity theme is very important as we go through all the conversations, and that's why I just didn't want to limit it to one space. Equity, I think, is going to be hopefully a forethought that goes into every decision, hopefully, that you make. As I tell my staff, we need to be students first and think about the consequences of every decision in terms of students. I think equity is a part of that conversation as well.
Thank you, President Zaragoza. Thank you, Chair. I don't have any more questions.
Any questions in Carson City? Oh, yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Regent, go ahead.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I'd like to just kind of circle back to what we all discussed initially and how we have these incredible events that are coming here to Nevada. We have F1. We had just had the Super Bowl. This is the time for us to really make a change. And we keep talking about our volatile economy. This is how we stop having such a volatile economy. We have this incredible tourism-based economy, but these are pathways when you're talking about P through 20. These are pathways to make sure that those kids don't get left behind, and then they can get a job. They can then be contributing people in our community. And I just really feel like it's imperative right now for us to take advantage of this. And I'm really happy that you ended with the presentation today, because I think you just really put an exclamation point on what the other presidents had said. And I'm grateful for you and all the work you do. And I just think this is the time and the place for us to really make a difference.
Were there questions in Carson City? Okay, seeing none. Mr. President, thank you for being here this afternoon. The unfortunate part about you being here later in the afternoon is you now earned a spot in all the late afternoon presentations because your passion will re-inspire all of us at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Thank you, sir. Okay. As I mentioned earlier, I'm going to, no disrespect intended, but request that the presentations from President Helens, President Dalpy, and President Hilgerson be moved to the March 19th meeting. And we will pass the agenda item number 8 to the March 19th meeting. I'll open up agenda item number 9 about new business and invite any requests from members for any agenda items or new business that you'd like to see on future agendas. Go ahead, Regent.
Thank you, Chair Hardesty. I was just wondering, I don't have the schedule in front of me, but are we listening to our students? Is there any time between now and the end of our work that we're going to have students come tell us their impacts?
I hope we're able to move that into the April agenda.
Okay, good. They're our most powerful voice.
The March agenda is a bit tight now, and so hopefully the April agenda will be able to plug in.
Thank you.
Ask the student body presidents or whomever are appropriate, and if you have specific suggestions, let me know.
Thank you.
Anybody else that would like to add something at this time? Okay, that doesn't foreclose you from sending me an email with a suggestion, which I welcome, or to, of course, Crystal or Heidi, and we'll take a look at it and put it into the schedule. So let's turn to public comment, as we're required to do and happy to do. This is the second opportunity for public comment during today's meeting. The process is the same as this morning. Public comment can be made in person at either meeting location. Additionally, those wishing to provide public comment telephonically may do so by calling 888-475-4499. At the prompt, please enter the meeting ID number, which is 874-8763-7141, and press pound. At this time, I'd like to invite public comment, first in Carson City. Is there anyone in Carson City who would like to make public comment?
Thank you. Kent Irvin, ERVIN, Nevada Faculty Alliance. Thank you so much for the robust discussions today. I have a few thoughts. The performance pool has too much emphasis on absolute growth. That is a problem with the impending demographic cliff of declining populations of high school students. Fundamentally, performance metrics should be ratios, not solely dependent on growth. Our now defunct weighted student credit hour formula was not a funding formula. It was a distribution formula after the overall budget was determined through the state-based budgeting process. Then the 2023 legislature stopped using the WSCH formula altogether. Some costs, like offering courses, track with student credit hours. Some costs, like advising and mentoring, track with the student headcounts. Some costs track with the number, type, and discipline of degrees and programs. Some costs track with the preparation and socioeconomic challenges of the incoming students. Some costs track with the number and types of personnel, and some costs track with buildings and infrastructure. These various costs may also have different inflation factors. The weighted student credit formula only captured one part of the cost of providing higher education for in-state students. Also, from 2014 to 2023, the budgeted dollar amount per weighted student credit hour decreased after inflation. I have a chart for that too. No formula works if it isn't funded. Total revenue needs to increase to meet the state's goals for higher education. With enough detail in tracking all these different cost inputs, maybe you can create a formula that is fair to the various institutions. The devil is in the details. But then mission creep might be rewarded, as President Pollard addressed. Chair Hardesty, I would like to suggest 3 important education topics for both the committee and consultants. First, presentation on the state budgeting mechanisms from both the Governor's Finance Office and the Fiscal Division of the Legislative Council Bureau. Any new formula has to work in the context of the state budgeting process. Second, an analysis of student fees outside the state-supported budgets, how they are established, how they are used, and how they vary across institutions. Third, the structure of labor in higher education. Full-time tenure-track faculty are now a minority of the professional labor force, which includes low-paid adjunct faculty and teaching assistants. Previous budgeting did not even include part-time instructors and teaching assistants, so their wages have never kept up. The Nevada Faculty Alliance looks forward to working with you through this process along with other stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Any further public comment from Carson City? All right, seeing none, we'll turn to Las Vegas.
Thank you. For the record, I'm Kevin Osorio Hernandez, proudly serving as the president of Nevada State Student Body. And I'm also the vice chair of the Nevada Student Alliance. I like to believe I mirror the ambitions of many I represent, especially as a proud first-generation student. However, as you all know, the current funding formula falls short in supporting our first-generation and non-traditional scholars. I don't believe it takes someone studying history like me to know that colleges and universities have historically not been built for students who look like me and the ones I speak for. Our students are the architects of our state and nation's future, yet many cannot achieve their dreams. So let me paint a picture of the bleak realities our students face. Take, for instance, a fellow first-generation student forced to halt their education due to the relentless rise in living costs, and they cannot continue to pay for their studies while at the same time taking care of their family. This tale is echoed throughout our institutions. As we continue in this work, let's not lose our sight of our primary duty, the well-being of students and their success. Our scholars face increasing challenges with food insecurity, which directly affects their success in academics, as well as the need for paid experiential learning opportunities for our diverse set of students, including those of immigrant origin. Mr. Chair and members of the committee, I thank you for your dedication to higher education. And as we keep moving forward, I propose to you, please keep in mind the student presidents of the Nevada Student Alliance, the Senate faculty chairs, and the institutional access programs, and invite us to engage directly with all of you. Such dialogue promises invaluable insights into the realities our students grapple with daily on our campuses. Again, thank you for your unwavering commitment, and I look forward to the work this committee does. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments, but you don't get away without a comment back. Would you please reach out to the Alliance, identify them, they can pick, and we'll see if we can get you on the agenda for April 30th to provide additional comment and input that the Alliance would like to share with the committee.
Most definitely, I'll be happy to. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the accommodation. Yes, sir.
How you doing? I'm Patrick Villa, V-I-L-L-A. I'm a math professor at CSN, and I'm the current Faculty Senate Chair. So, say a very quick statement here. It is not a criticism of anything. I just want to point out something here. So, you've all done a great job. I know this is a tough, long meeting, and the university presidents, they did a great presentation, and it was great, and it was necessary that it had to go longer than scheduled. But I'll point out, this is an experience is what's happening to the community colleges. Funding kind of gets priority on the universities, and we're sometimes not allowed to get everything we need. Just like today, only one community college was able to speak. Again, that's nobody's fault. Everyone was doing the right thing, but that happens at times. There was a priority set. They had to get things done. Sometimes, though, community colleges are the afterthought, the second thought, and we didn't have time for you. We didn't have money for you. We didn't have whatever for you. And I just want to point that out. That this is, like I said, it's nobody did anything bad. It was just a, magnification in real life is how this goes for us. And that's how we felt it a number of times. In many years I've been there, we've kind of experienced that where, well, they kind of ran out of something for us. So that was all. But thank you all for your work today.
Well, let me just observe that the president's representative on the committee is from the community college, not from the four-year universities.
I'm sorry?
The presidents of the institutions represented on the committee is a representative from the community college, not the four-year universities.
I appreciate that too. Yes, sir, I do. And I totally appreciate that. Thank you for that.
Okay, just wanted to let you know that we recognize the importance of the community colleges in this state.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, anything further, members of the committee? All right, any further public comment? All right, seeing none, we will adjourn today and see you all on March the 19th. Pardon me? Oh, telephone calls. Yes, I forgot that part. Broadcast, are there any folks on the telephone who would like to make public comment?
Thank you, Chair. The public line is open and working. However, there are no callers to provide public comment at this time.
Thank you for your help today. We appreciate it. We'll be in adjournment then until March the 19th. See you all then.
Okay, so I talked with him and you. Would it be okay if